Okay, let's get started. Before we begin, Stacy Spire is going to say a few words about our local organization here at BAM. Stacy?
Hello, my name is Stacy Spire. I am an artist who's been making math art and studying mathematics for over 10 years. We're so glad that you could join us today for this BAM meeting. BAM stands for Bay Area Artists and Mathematicians. We're a group that gets together to talk about different areas of art and math, share presentations, do some show and tell. It's kind of an informal Bridges or Gathering for Gardner. Let's see, I've been helping to organize it for the last year along with Scott Vorthman and Frank Ferris. It was Vince Matsko who started this version of our group, but before that, the octahedral group used to meet to share mathematical experiences, and that group was led by Vi Hart, Andrea Huxley, and Gwen Fisher. We're really glad that the structure of BAM was here to facilitate this memorial for John Conway. We're so excited that all of you could be here today, and I just have to say it means a lot to me to be able to honor such an amazing person who developed so much math that I care about. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Thank you, Stacy. So, welcome everyone to the special BAM session to share memories of John Conway. I'm your host, Bob Hearn, today. And in addition to Stacy, Scott Wortman will be moderating, and Frank Ferris is doing the Zoom hosting for us today. So, wow, is all I can say. I am overwhelmed with the group of speakers that we've managed to put together for this session. This just sort of snowballed from an idea from Carl Schaefer. Why don't we share Conway memories at our next meeting? To this incredible set of speakers, and I think it's going to be a valuable historical record. Actually, we're going to save it and share it. And I have to say it's a little bit ironic. You know, we lost John to coronavirus, and yet it's because of the coronavirus that all of us are now accustomed to meeting like this. And under other circumstances, I just don't think we would be able to put this group of speakers together. So to kick things off, let me just say I'm wearing this Escher shirt here today in honor of John. It's my understanding this was one of his favorite shirts, that he had several copies of this shirt, that he had this exact shirt and he wore it until it dissolved, and then he got another one and wore it until he dissolved, and a third one, and then he couldn't get them anymore. So every time I would see him at Gathering for Gardner or a combinatorial game theory workshop, he would always say, "Pop, you've got that shirt, I need that shirt." So that's my brief memory of John. I didn't know him as well as many of you did. So I'm going to be moderating. Scott Vortman will be moderating as well. And Scott, would you like to say a word or two?
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, so I'm Scott Worthman. I feel so privileged to be amongst you all. This is an amazing event, and we all owe Bob a big thank you for all the organizing he's done. It's wonderful to see you all here and to help us remember John Conway and all his contributions and the way he's touched us. So with that, I think we should turn things over to our first speaker. We probably won't be able to do introductions for everyone, but Siobhan Roberts, many of you probably know, is the biographer of John Conway. I can recommend the book highly. So Siobhan, we're going to give you the floor.
Great, thank you very much, Scott, and thank you, Bob, and everyone for organizing this magnificent gathering. Where to start, really? I mean, I'm sure for many of you, but I would say one thing that I've been thinking over the past 2 weeks is that John was obviously this biographer's dream come true and worst nightmare in a couple of ways. He was just so incredibly generous with his time. I spent countless hours with him at Princeton, and he's such a great storyteller, and he told me story upon story, and the book would not be what what it is without John's extreme generosity. And it would be a pale simile if he was not present so much in the book, and he sort of talked so much that he got his own font, which just made it a lot of fun from start to finish. On the downside, he was kind of congenitally incapable of answering a yes or no question, which made it difficult to fact check in the end stages. So, I'd ask him a question, about the surreal numbers. Did you, think about this that way, or, some specific thing? And he was like, well, did I ever tell you the story about when Don Knuth came to visit? And I'm just like, yes, John, I've got all the stories. Like, I just need to zero in on this specific detail. But, all in all, it was a wonderful process. And certainly when I was faced with writing his obituary, it was a bit awkward because, of course, by the end of it, he was a good friend. He was not just my subject. And I looked back and found an old email, if you could believe it, from John, and he signed off, "Your loyal subject, Jay." So he was totally embedded in the process as well. But I found myself having to page through the book to remind myself of all the wonderful, wonderful gems, and really found myself newly agog at just all the wonderments or wondermentalia that he both bestowed and inflicted on me. And it was just such a delight to go back through. And I think one of the highlights in our, almost 10 years together researching the book was a trip to Cambridge for research with Gareth, his 10-year-old, and we played games with his 4 wonderful daughters, Annie, Ellie, Susie, and Rosie. And Annie recently remarked that, growing up with her dad was like fireworks every day. Like, you just did not know what to expect. And that was very much my experience. And I thought I'd just finish with one of the small delights that he bestowed upon me. It wasn't the last visit, but it was the second last visit. I made some kind of, banal comment about, oh, time flies. And he came back with, time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. And that was just so John, it's just kind of like this delightful bon mot or gem that kind of sets you off. And I've repeated that so many times since then. So in closing, I look forward to hearing many new stories from everybody, and also being reminded of stories that I've no doubt heard already, but I always love hearing them again.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. Next up, we have Pete Winkler. Hopefully Pete is ready.
I am. Yeah, I've had many delightful conversations with John, most recently about puzzles or about free will. But I'd like to give you one short, but I think typical anecdote. So it is September 28th, 2006, which John would instantly tell you was a Thursday. I was giving a talk at Princeton and about stacking bricks so as to lean over the edge of a table. And in response to a question, I explained that you can extend the overhang slightly by twisting each brick a little bit in the horizontal plane so that the bricks meet corner to corner instead of end to end. There is a sudden shout from the middle of the audience. That's called skintling. Okay, so, well, I wouldn't put it past John to invent a word on the spot, but I looked it up, and skintling means precisely what I had just described. And when I Googled the word, I got 6 hits. So what this means is that John was approximately one of 6 people in the entire world that knew what skintling meant, and probably the only one who could come up with the word on the spur of the moment. So we will all miss, John will all miss that kind of erudition, and I'm happy to pass on to the next person.
Hi, this is Vicki. I think I'm up next. So it's hard for me to pick just one story about John, but I chose to tell you about the first time I met him. I arrived at Princeton University Press in the spring of 2001. I was delighted to meet Diana Conway, who was a publicist for the math book program at Princeton. It was great to work with someone who knew the math community and how to market math books. We also had a lot of friends in common, most of them mathematicians. When I arrived, the biology editor had been handling the math book, so I thought it would be a good idea to check over the math manuscripts that were headed for production. There was one in particular that needed a little bit, or maybe a lot of help. I was able to handle most things, including changing moonlight conjecture back to moonshine conjecture. I think our biology editor didn't think that mathematicians had much fun, so they wouldn't know what moonshine was. There was one statement that was attributed to John Conway that I didn't think could quite possibly be true. So it said that John could solve any configuration of Rubik's Cube in X seconds. I put in X because I couldn't actually remember how many seconds it was. And that seemed pretty amazing to me. So I asked Diana if she could confirm that with John. Well, she immediately said, "You want to go ask him?" I'd never met John, so I was really excited. I was going to meet John Conway. So I got my stuff together and I started to head out the back door of the press, heading down to Fine Hall. Diana said, "Wait, he's in his downtown office." I didn't know there was a downtown math office, but I soon found out it was Small World Coffee. If you've been to Princeton, you know what that is and where that is. So when we arrived, I met John and he suggested I go get some coffee. Oh, and yes, that I could get him a refill on my way. So we all sat down and we were chatting, and I brought up my problem to John, that I wasn't sure that he could actually solve Rubik's Cube as the manuscript was claiming. And he said, "No, that's not true." And he seemed a little bit annoyed. And then he said, "I can do it much faster than that." And I thought, well, wow, how many seconds faster could he do it? And he told me he could do it 3 seconds faster. And so I said, "Oh, I am so sorry. I will make sure that that's corrected." And I was really, really scared. I thought that he would think I was very incompetent and I would never see him again. So then he more calmly said, "Of course, there are other people who have broken my record." And then I more confidently said, "Well, this section in this book is about your accomplishments, so I'm not sure I need to mention those records." And then he just smiled. But from that time forward, that we became really good friends. And I met John about once a month after that for over 18 years. We met at Small Worlds and at Fine Hall, either in the common room or in the hallway in an alcove where there was a blackboard and 2 chairs. This was convenient because we could chat with everyone who walked by. We never planned these meetings, they just happened. If I dropped by and he wasn't around, I'd leave a message or pick up one he left for me from his filing cabinet, which was really under the cushion of one of the chairs. We had amazing conversations about nothing that always led to something. They were about ideas for new books and how to explain some great math ideas to people who hated math or thought it was hard. We wanted them to fall in love with math. We talked about new math puzzles and gadgets we'd seen or heard about. Sometimes he talked and I cut colorful paper strips for him, which he could no longer do after he had his stroke. We made all kinds of things out of them and he hung them in his real office, which he never used. Some of them disappeared and I don't know what he actually ever used them for. Maybe he just wanted me to keep busy, I'm not sure. After John could not always make it to Fine Hall, we would meet at the E-Quad, which is half the difference from his apartment to Fine Hall. Or sometimes we'd meet in Small World Coffee that had just opened near his apartment. We would exchange papers that needed to be retrieved from or taken to his file cabinet in Fine Hall. We joked a lot about pretending to be secret agents. We weren't very successful, however, nor were we very secret because everyone knew where our secret filing cabinet was. We had many adventures by plane, car, subway, taxi, and train, to all kinds of math meetings, MoMath many times, and local middle and high schools. We had fun over pizza with the undergrad math club students and everyone else who came into the common room. He was my go-to guy for explanations about math, which were far beyond my math degree. He was truly one of a kind.
Thank you, Vicki. Our next speaker is Paula Hildebrandt. Paul, are you here? Great.
So yeah, I liked the reference to the filing cabinet. you have to ask Amina, who's coming up later, to tell us the story of how Conway invented the filing cabinet, reinvented the filing cabinet. It's a great story. I really just wanted to share John talking, telling his own story, and Mark Pelletier is sort of the MC at this one. It's a meeting with Coxeter, and I tried to make a movie of this, and I'm hoping I can just turn it on for you. They were dedicating Mark's hyperdodecahedron to Coxeter at the Fields Institute. And I'm very grateful to Amina for sending me this video.
And the second one says that ye being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is breadth and length and depth and height. Now I can count, and that's 4 dimensions.
oh yes, I should mention my Armenian friend Paul Tonchian, Tonchian.
P.S. Donchian opened his door to a fairy land of pure science. His wire and cardboard models explain highest mathematics. And if you look at the right, it says enthralls thousands in Chicago. But Einstein was barred from exhibit at fair, lest crowds crush him and models.
I just want to step back 20 years, if I may, to Professor Coxeter's 75th birthday celebrations. And I just want to tell you a little story. There were, of course, all the people there were students of Coxeter or grand students of Coxeter or maybe even great-grand students of Coxeter. But they were all getting up saying how this man had been great inspiration in their lives. Well, I just, rather brashly thought I'd do something different. And when I stood up, I said I was here to forgive Professor Coxeter for having tried to murder me. I don't show which actually has elements of the truth about it. A long, long time ago, Professor Coxeter came to Cambridge and gave a lecture. And I didn't realize at the time that was his attempt to murder me. He chose for his weapon something that Agatha Christie never thought of, a mathematical problem. And obviously, what actually happened, I walked out of the lecture room and crossed the main road in Cambridge, and just as I was in the middle of the road, the solution hit me. And it wasn't the only thing that hit me.
Thank you, Paul.
I guess that's it. It was nice to be a part of all this. Nice to, and looking forward to hearing what Amina has to say.
Okay, Marjorie, you should be unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you so much for including me in this. It's really wonderful to celebrate John, and I think that's the only way I can think about it without crying. So I've been torn between telling you endless anecdotes and saying something more focused, and I decided to do both, but in a very short amount of time. The anecdote I wanted to start with is when I first met him. And this was at a conference in the 1980s, and it was a conference, I think it was in France. And I had a bad cold of some sort, and I was sneezing through the entire thing. And at the end, it was a week long. At the end of the week, John came up to me to say goodbye, and he said, "I shall always remember you with a red nose." And I thought, oh, that's really funny. And then I didn't see him again for 5 years. And the first thing he said when he saw me again was, "How's your cold?" So that to me would epitomize John's memory, although of course we all know it was sometimes selective. But anyway, what I want to talk about is John is a member and a shaper of mathematical communities. So last week, as the news of John's death flew around the world, I received an email from an Iranian contributor to the Mathematical Intelligencer, urging us to plan a special issue in his memory, and we're going to do that. John, this correspondent said, was none such. And none such is exactly the right word. He was none such in many different ways. And one was his keen intuition of other people's feelings. I remember a conference in Toronto, I think it was, and at the end of the afternoon session, we were all gathering around and didn't know what to do. And one of the speakers, who was notoriously full of himself, turned to his chosen few and said, let's go to dinner, and leaving the rest of us standing there. And John instantly, who wasn't one of those few, instantly smiled his big smile at the rest of us and said cheerfully, yes, let's all go. And so off we happily went. And that to me was very, very characteristic of John, is that he had a sense of how people were feeling and how to make people feel included, and did it when his opportunities arose. And I think it was that intuition that made a real difference in an NSF program in the early 90s called the Regional Geometry Institutes, or RGIs. And this was a proof of concept testing ground for what became the very successful Park City Mathematics Institutes. The idea was to bridge the gulfs in the American mathematical community. That's the gulfs between the university and college faculty on the one hand, and high school teachers on another, and college and graduate students on the third. And the bridge that we're trying to build there consisted of bringing representatives of these three communities together for a whole month to focus on common mathematical themes. And somehow there was supposed to be the kind of interaction that would make these bridges. So I was part of a group out here in Western Massachusetts of several different colleges that proposed to have geometry sessions and to do this, and we got the grant. And 3 of these RGIs were held in successive years at colleges here in Western Massachusetts, and they were run by those of us who were on who had applied for the grant, and I was one of them, and I directed the 3rd year. And the first 2 years, the bridges actually were one way, with researchers graciously telling teachers what math really is and giving them a glimpse of its beauty. And in some ways, they almost epitomized what the problem was. But nevertheless, we tried to break that down. And finally, in the 3rd year, we managed it. The 3 communities were one, thinking together and building models together and exploring their properties. And at that time, we thought, well, we've learned a lot from experience now. Now we know how to bring these groups together. But then looking back at it, I think, no, that wasn't it. The difference was that John Conway was there in the 3rd year. And John was there. And you can just imagine. I'll show you a picture that you can see that. He's there working at a dining table. Is it visible? And that was John. John was, yeah. And that's Charles Radin over here, and Doris Schetzsnyder is over here, and John Sullivan is here. They were part of some of the faculty that were also there. And John was very, very, very much the center of things, and very, very active. And our theme that year was tilings and patterns, and it was John was in his element. But the thing is that he didn't see 3 communities. He didn't have to build bridges. For him, this was all one. He made absolutely no distinction between the different groups or between what they knew, what they didn't know. For him, it was all an excitement to just investigate things and find out about them. And the models that we made were, by the way, his famous biprism. These were the convex version of the Einstein, a single aperiodic tile. And I'll show you a picture of that. These are a photograph of these, if you can see that. These are single tiles that, when fitted together, can tile only aperiodically. And there had been a non-convex version before, but John managed to make a convex one. This was very exciting. And Doris Schetzsnyder, who was there, made a template for this, or a net, and we all cut them out. And you can imagine everybody all together, teachers, students, faculty, everybody, excitingly making these things and putting them together and talking about their properties and how does it work and how does it not work. It really was a community activity in the most wonderful way. And this went on and on the whole time that John was there. It was one thing after another, ways in which everybody could get excited, could join together and really create something wonderful. And I think this was the proof of the concept, that John was the proof of the concept, the magic ingredient for this. And never forgotten the wonderful way that he really drew everybody together. And it was because, not just because of the math that he was able to show them, but because his instinctive sympathy for everybody who was there and being able to pull them together. He was magnetism in his charm and his human intuition. He was none such. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. Next up is Chamberlain Fong.
Okay. In honor of Conway, I'm wearing a Lego hat with a Conway minifigure in there. And I've given him some female companionship in the form of Marge Simpson and Princess Leia. And in the background, this is initials, JHC. That's to honor Conway. And let me share my screen now. So I'm going to be giving a brief talk about Conway's doomsday algorithm. Title of my talk is What Day of the Week Was Conway Born? His birthday, by the way, is December 26, 1937. So what is the doomsday algorithm? It's an algorithm invented by Conway for mental calculation of the day of the week. So your input is any date in the Gregorian calendar, and the output would be the day of the week for that input date. And it could be done in your head without paper and pencil, with practice, of course. Now, there have been many calendar algorithms. In fact, the great mathematician Gauss has his own calendar algorithm. In 1887, Lewis Carroll came up with the first mental algorithm for calculating the day of the week of an input date in the Gregorian calendar. Yes, it's the same Lewis Carroll that wrote Alice in Wonderland. In May 1967, Martin Gardner found out about Lewis Carroll's algorithm and wrote about it in his Scientific American column. And this is what inspired Conway to come up with his own calendar algorithm. And now the days of the week are well behaved mathematically. You could think of them as isomorphic to the groups, to the integers, modulo 7. So at the core of Conway's algorithm is his observation that certain memorable dates always fall on the same day of the week for any year. For example, in here you have April 4, June 6, August 8, October 10, and December 12, 4/4, 6/6, 8/8, 10/10, 12/12. They always fall on the same day of the week for any year. So, for example, here in 2020, I've encircled these dates on the calendar, and they're all on a Saturday. Conway also observed that the dates 5/9, 9/5, 7/11, and 11/7 also fall on this same day of the week for any year. He called this day of the week doomsday, by the way. So this could easily be remembered by the phrase working 9 to 5 at the 7-Eleven. So for this year, here the dates are also encircled. You can see that they all fall on a Saturday. So Conway came up with this system for, once you know what this doomsday is, or I would call it anchor date, you could figure out what the day of the week is for nearby dates. So he had here's a table for every day, every month. So this year, this doomsday or anchor day always falls on a Saturday. In 1937, the year that he was born, they were all on a Sunday. So the gist of his algorithm is, once you figure out that December 12, 1937 is a Sunday, it's very easy to figure out the day of the week that his birthday was on. And I wrote an article about this doomsday algorithm in Scientific American that has more details, because I only glossed over the details in this presentation. I'm going to share it later. And I'd like to thank John Conway for coming up with this algorithm, which has given me lots of joy. Thank you, John Conway.
Okay, Amina, you should be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Mina.
Well, I wanted to thank Paul for taking all that video footage that he received yesterday. It's about 10 days worth of raw footage, unedited, to find what he actually wanted to find. So that's excellent. Thank you, Paul. Well, that happened to be the occasion that I first physically got to meet John Conway, which is at Donald Coxeter's house, where we were allowed to look through books and letters and all kinds of things. And that's where John's character really came out. But particular story I wanted to share was the director of the Fields took all of us out to dinner to a very, very ritzy, fancy to-do place. And after about 4 or 5 bottles of fine Canadian wine, we were rather tipsy, and John happened to know that the moment was perfect. And he leaned over to Mark Pelletier and said, "Mark, take off your shoelaces." At which point, Mark took off his shoelaces, and I wanted to kind of take a look at what John was doing over there because I had an interest in knots, mostly from mountaineering. But I wanted to see what type of knot or not John was tying Mark and him together with. And in the meantime, the director of the fields was tying me and himself together in a tie. So needless to say, I wasn't paying much attention. I was mostly engaged in looking at what John was doing. And then we both tried to get untangled. And I recall having to lift my leg over the director of the field's head to try and get untangled. And it was quite the tipsy event. But that was sort of my beginning of my relationship with John. It was in 2002 at the dedication of Mark's 120 cell at the Fields Institute, and I do believe the audio is available on the Fields website. Mark did an entire lecture on Paul Donchen, the model builder, and where John gave that wonderful speech of how Donald tried to murder him. So over the years, John and I would be engaged in trying to stump each other on puzzles and games. So it was rather vexing. He'd usually have some type of puzzle for me to solve, and I also would bring him something rather interesting, I had hoped. And then the file cabinet story. Well, what should I do first? Well, the only puzzle that I can recall actually stumping John on is this one here, which is by Rinus Roelofs. And it is a helical dissection of the tetrahedron. And I was vexing him during a Roger Penrose lecture at G4G. And John's hand would come in my lap as I would be twisting this thing and asked to basically see if he could play with it. And he would be engaged in trying to fiddle with this thing, and then he would get up and from the back of the room argue with Roger Penrose in mid-sentence, and then sit back down and try and solve the puzzle, which he actually did not solve. So I'm sure Rinus was pleased with that. But Paul asked me to say something about the filing cabinet. Well, one day John and I were talking about, how disorganized things can get with all these math things around. And he was saying that he had a brilliant idea. He discovered the filing cabinet. And then he realized that he had one in the corner of his office. So anyhow, I will let the next person speak if they would like. I have too many stories. I could keep going. So I'm sure I'd like to hear some other people's feedback and stories as well.
Thank you, Amina. Our next scheduled speaker is Roger Penrose. I'm not sure if Roger is here. There is a Roger. Let me unmute you. Is this Roger Penrose?
I hope so. But you can hear me, can you?
Yes.
Oh, good. No, well, as a co-Britishman, British subject, I don't know if that makes much difference. But I used to know him when he was in England, in Cambridge. He always used to give lectures which were extraordinarily popular. All the undergraduates and non-mathematicians too were always, everything he did was fun. I think that was one of the greatest things about him. He was a very distinguished mathematician as well in group theory. I was not somebody who knew a great deal of that work in that detailed work that he was doing there, but I knew he was very distinguished, and I knew him as a puzzler and a fun mathematician in many ways. I think one of the things, let me mention one particular puzzle. I was given a version of this by my brother Oliver, I think, for my birthday one time. He had several of these. I think I don't know for every odd number you can do it, but you take an odd number greater than 1 anyway, and you make a cube. So let's say 5 by 5 by 5. I think the one he gave me. And then you have pieces which fill this, they're 5 little cubes, and then you have all the others are made up of that shape. I think there must have been, I've just lost track of how many pieces there were altogether, but they're all just rectangular pieces. It's completely trivial, you say. And you put them in the box, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's impossible. You have to know what you're doing because it has a diagonal symmetry. Of course, the box doesn't show that because you lift the top off and you don't think about the diagonal symmetry. But you have to put the little cubes all along the diagonal, and then you can fit all the other ones around with its symmetry. And I gave one to a small child, which was 3 by 3 by 3, and I don't think he could do it, which was quite extraordinary. But anyway, I always had a great respect for him and the elegance of what he was doing. Everybody knows about the game of life and all that, which was done with very, very simple rules, and you can make it do all sorts of things like make a Turing machine and things like that out of it. I knew him first, I think, well, in Cambridge probably. Maybe it was at I think let me mention one thing, which was when I met him at a conference, one of the British Mathematical Colloquium. They had these conferences every year, and I think I'd come in rather late or something, and I tried to get them to squeeze me in a talk on something I just thought of, and they wouldn't do that. But at least I talked to John about it, and I had these 2 little shapes, which were kites and darts, with a certain matching rule, and it would only tile the plane non-periodically. So he picked up on this very quickly, and this wasn't published anywhere, but he went to see Martin Gardner, and the first publication was this article by Martin Gardner, which was based on conversations that he'd had with John, and it was a very good article, and it was the first time these tiles became known by anybody. It was a thing which I played around with a lot later. I don't know how much time I've got, but let me mention the last time I met him. I think it was the last time, which was probably, I think, about 4 years ago in Princeton. He wasn't terribly well, I remember, and we talked about our respective proofs of Morley's trisector theorem. This is the theorem: we have any old triangle, we trisect all the angles, and then where they meet, they make a little triangle in the middle, which is equilateral. Very remarkable result. And he had a very elegant proof of this, which he showed me. And I said, well, I have a proof too. Mine is simpler, but yours is much more elegant. Mine wasn't elegant at all, but you start from the triangle, and you build up the thing, and you can do it without much thinking. But that was really the last time I think I saw him, and it was a great shame because I always gained so much from talking to him. As I say, everything was fun. He always had a different angle on things that you'd never think of. And he was an amazing mathematician as well as an amazing puzzlist. I think as puzzles go, I would think this one with the different rectangular shapes is such a simple thing, but yet difficult. I think I picked that out as a particularly elegant puzzle. Let me leave it at that. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about him. He was a wonderful man.
Thank you so much for joining us, Roger, and thank you for those stories. Next, we have Doris Schatzschneider. You ready, Doris?
Yes, I am. I, like most of you, have many anecdotes, but I'm only going to tell you 2. And actually, I'm going to follow up on something Roger just mentioned. I first met John in 1976 when he came to a conference on recreational mathematics at Miami University in Ohio. This was in September 1976. He had come directly from being with Martin Gardner in New York at Martin's home. And he said he was literally held hostage by Martin for a week so that Martin could pump him from getting all the information he could about the Penrose tilings, the aperiodic tilings. And so John had come fresh from that hostage situation at Martin Gardner's house. And of course, later that all that information became part of Martin's column in the January 1977 issue of Scientific American. So John gave a talk, and he did it in John's style with quickly drawn images on a acetate sheets using an overhead projector. And the talk was great. People loved it. But what I really remember most about that conference and John is later in the day when there was a break, out on the grass, out on the lawn, there lay John, belly down, flopped on the grass, and around him were all these students, probably a dozen, literally all head to head, like human spokes in a wheel. And John had gathered them, or they had gathered to John, just like a moth goes to light. And John was in his element. And that was the first time I saw how John was just a magnet to other people. He delighted in it, they delighted in him. And I called him a Pied Piper for mathematics. And that was the first time I saw it in action. A second anecdote is much more personal. Shortly after my book on Escher's work on symmetry, I talked with John, and he had gotten a copy. And he told me when he got the copy, he just really wanted to gobble it up. And then he said, no, I decided I couldn't do that. I was going to ration myself. So he said he put it on the piano and he allowed himself to only turn one page a day. And so, thank you, John. What a compliment. That's what I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Doris. Next on the schedule is Derek Smith.
Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Smith. I'm a professor at Lafayette College and a student of John's at Princeton. Big thanks to BAM for organizing this event. It's wonderful. I was lucky to be his student and even luckier to work with him on a book on quaternions and octonions right after finishing my PhD. He was a great mentor and friend. Several years ago, we went back to work on the book, hoping to prepare a second edition. We'd only gotten a little ways into it when I had to deal with a pretty heavy teaching load at Lafayette and couldn't visit Princeton regularly. And he got pulled into some other projects like his wonderful biography. I'm so happy that came to fruition. And later his health declined, so we never got back to it. So the memories that are most vivid for me weren't about any serious mathematical work, but were the times that we shared some good laughs together with our families. His visits to Lafayette, often with Diana and Gareth, when Gareth were young, were really special. And so I want to share one of those now, and if there's time, I've got another anecdote. So one time he stayed overnight to give a lunchtime talk at Lafayette the next day. And he was up the morning before well before I was, and he left the house, and he didn't tell me where he was. And these were the days before cell phones could easily track you down. So I did find him at, where else? One of the 3 local coffee shops, the third one I checked. And he had a stack of papers out on the table, and several of the sheets were covered with graphs. And so these graphs, it turned out, represented positions of a wooden sliding puzzle he was then obsessed with. And so a wooden sliding puzzle looks like this. I don't know that it was the one that he was investigating, but it's one where you have some wooden pieces, contained in a board, and then one of them, if you move the pieces around enough, will hopefully, if you're clever, then slide out because it's thinner than the rest. And again, I don't remember if that was the one, but what he'd done is he basically had a node on the graph represent a position that the puzzle could be in, and then an edge join 2 of these nodes if you could get from one to the other by a simple move. And each graph had 60 vertices. It was the same graph represented on different sheets of paper and at least twice as many edges. It was a pretty complicated graph, and there were some edges going off the top and around the sides, coming back through the bottom. And over the course of 2 or 3 hours, he created about 7 or 8 of these graphs, and they were much like each one was much like the previous one, except what he did is he took 5 or 10 of the vertices at the top, and then he moved them to the bottom, and he was hoping he could, kind of reconfigure the edges and their placement better. And I don't really know what he was trying to do. I don't know what he was going for, except maybe a better presentation of this graph and understanding some components of it. So we got up to leave, and he had to give a talk in half an hour. And I grabbed the stacks and looked at the first graph he'd drawn and the last one, and they were essentially identical. I mean, you couldn't hold them up to the light, but everything was in the same spot, edges, everything. And so he'd been working at this furiously for 3 hours, and I told him he'd just spent 3 hours getting back to the starting point, and he smiled quickly, and then we just laughed for several minutes and paid for our breakfast and left. And was it a waste of time? No. What it was to me is just a perfect example of his focus and tenacity, which served him so well on many of the important mathematics problems he was working on, but also on the analysis of sliding puzzles and games and anything that sparked his curiosity, because the investigation was the thing. It wasn't where he was headed. But it was also an example of him taking 2 or 3 steps beyond what the reasonable person would do. And he often said that was an important guiding principle for him. And when several times to me, he said I was being too reasonable. And if that comes from some people, that's a compliment, but it's certainly not a compliment if it comes from John. One last anecdote, I may have a little time, but we were working one day on the book, and we were creating some tables of groups, and he wrote down something I didn't understand. He was at the board, I was taking notes, and I thought about it, and he kept going. A minute later, I stopped him and said, "John, what happened there?" And he said, "Oh, that's cohomology." And I said, "Okay." And then 2 minutes passed, and I said, "John, we haven't used cohomology anywhere in the book before." And he said, "Oh, cohomology is what I say when I don't really understand what's going on." So it's kind of a question. I'm throwing this question out. Has he ever used that with anybody else? I'd love to know that was a standard thing that he did. Oh, even better if he just came up with it on the fly. But let me know if he's used cohomology for things he doesn't understand before. So anyway, thanks, John, for the many good lessons and memories, and may you rest in play. And I guess Tim's up next. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Tim, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. So I do want to confirm that what Derek said, that yes, and something that was sufficiently nonsense, yes, Conway would call it cohomology. And actually, I do want to thank BAAM, a different BAM here, for organizing this wonderful event. And actually, I'm going to embarrass Derek now, because I want to thank him and Alex Reba and Psychoshin and Joe Cohn and all the other folks that I'm sure there are many other people here who really were great companions to John in the last years of his life. And so there, Derek, I did it to you. Actually, I do want to thank BAA. Should I go now, or is it actually? Can somebody tell me? Are you seeing me, or because I was going to do the knock trick.
Yes, Tim, we can see you.
Okay. So I was trying to figure out how, in just a few minutes, I could convey what it was like to be a Conway student and what it was like to talk to him every day. And so it's kind of like this. And those of you who have seen this will immediately recognize what's about to happen. It's sort of like you'd be talking to him and just be sort of ordinary. You're trying to follow along what he's doing, and a miracle would appear. And and for those of you, if anybody, is there anybody who has never seen this? Yeah. So anyway, so if you didn't know, of course, this is impossible. But because with the rope, I form a closed circle which cannot possibly knot itself without disruption. Anyway, so you'd be talking with them, and suddenly the impossible would happen. And actually, and of course, there was always a lot of showmanship to it. So if you want to learn, I think I'm going to actually try to teach this trick in a minute. But if you want to learn, but the things he told me how to sell it is that here's how he would always do it. He would loop over like this and say, now he'd always have some sort of patsy helping him along with this, and he would say, "Do as I do."
Oh wait.
Yes, so do as I do, and then and now reach through here. Yes, reach through here, and then of course I just messed it up, but you can sort of see. And the important thing there is, especially if you mess it up like I just did, is to sell it by looking at your right hand and looking at the knot down here. Yes, so there was always a lot of showmanship involved in dealing with Conway. But now I feel that I was thinking about this. I haven't seen a whole lot of people do this, and it is also true that I have to say on social media I saw Tim Gowers say that, oh, you know, I saw somebody, Conway did this knot trick for me once, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out, and I wish, can somebody tell me the trick? And so, and then, you know, this is actually in Lewis Kaufman's book on knots, but and I know there's a professional magician here to whom I apologize for messing it up the second time I did it. But is it reasonable for me to try to teach everybody the trick now?
I think we're okay on time, Timothy, if you want to try, yeah.
So let me teach you the trick. So you hold this in your right hand, and you loop over to your left hand. There's a hole. You want to make a big hole in the middle, and you reach through, and you pull back, and then I hope you can see there's this state where in your left hand. So so if you really want to learn this, go. I guess you'd want to go look at this on YouTube later. But there's a state where you have this sort of caught loop on your left hand, and then you pass it through, and that's where the knot is created in your left hand. So anyway, it really was. So just to show you again, it really was wonderful being a Conway student. Life was like this every day. A little bit of the impossible, and so thanks to him, and thanks to everybody for being here at this lovely event.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm sorry about those technical problems. Most people are all but the speaker are supposed to be muted, so I'm not sure how the screen got set to the wrong speaker there. But please don't interrupt the current speaker. Next up is Aaron Siegel. Aaron, are you ready?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. So for those of you who don't know me, I was a PhD student of Elwyn Berlekamp, studying combinatorial game theory, and continue to be actively interested in the subject. And of course, for anyone studying combinatorial games, John was a defining influence. He was one of the founding fathers of the modern subject, along with Berlekamp and Richard Guy. And he was the discoverer of the axiomatic theory of partisan games and of the surreal numbers. I had the pleasure of meeting him on a number of occasions. I didn't know him as well as many of you, but I did have the opportunity to spend some time with him in the 2006 to 07 academic year when I was doing postdoctoral work at Princeton. And shortly after I arrived in Princeton, he had a fairly serious stroke and ended up in the hospital. And I'd visit him regularly in the hospital. We were working on trying to understand a game he'd invented called MEM, and was just struck by, he just had a stroke, but his mathematical enthusiasm and imagination didn't suffer in the least. It turned out to be a game where it's fairly easy to calculate the values and it's easy to identify patterns, but unexpectedly difficult to prove anything about it. And so I'd bring him a stack of printouts of computations each time I visited him. And he'd sit there just intensely scrutinizing, finding some new patterns, and then demand more output on my next visit. And after he was discharged, I continued to visit him once a week at his home in Princeton. And of course, I always wanted to talk about games, but it seemed like every week he had a different topic he wanted to talk about. Sometimes it was set theory or geometry. And I was really struck by what a singularly imaginative mathematician he was, and how wide-ranging his mathematical imagination was. I'll say one other thing. I think I had the pleasure of spending time with John and Elwyn together on a number of occasions, and I think it would be hard to find two personalities that are more different. And I think there were frictions there that have been well documented. But what always struck me when I observed them together was just how much they respected one another, just the mutual reverence. I think Conway, he left his stamp on a huge range of mathematical subjects. And I think some of the other topics he contributed to might be, more widely recognized by a broader community. But I do believe games and surreal numbers were among his proudest achievements. I'm going to close with a quote from Conway. And he said, quote, and this was from a lecture he delivered in, I believe, 1999. He said, "I used to feel guilty in Cambridge that I spent all day playing games while I was supposed to be doing mathematics. Then, when I discovered surreal numbers, I realized that playing games is mathematics." And I think that's it's an inspiration and a reminder to the rest of us, really, to just have fun and follow our passions. And we never know where they might lead. So, and thank you so much to BAM and the organizers for putting this event together and having me here.
Thank you, Aaron. That's a great quote and a great sentiment to end on for us all to keep in mind. Scott Kim, are you ready?
Sure. I need to share my screen here. Everybody see on numbers and games?
Yes.
Great. So I knew John. I've met him at many conferences. I was a contributor to Martin Gardner's wonderful column in Scientific American, and of course, John was probably one of the most frequent and best loved contributors. So got to know him through the Martin Gardner community, and which includes many of the people here. One thing I really appreciated about John, Aaron just referred to it, was first of all, he made a decision early on to not care too much about what other people thought. It was okay to just pursue whatever he was interested in, and maybe it would lead someplace significant, and maybe not, but that not worrying about, just going ahead and pursuing what was interesting is very inspiring to me right now. Besides being a great mathematician, everybody has talked about how friendly and inclusive he was. Siobhan referred to that. I really appreciate the amount of care he put into how he explained ideas. He would jump up and, as was mentioned, he would do very physical demonstrations. He would hop. He would get pieces of string. He'd get people organized to act out something. Carl Schaefer and I have been doing that, and so anyway, I appreciate that. It's, I think, an underappreciated and area of mathematics that could be, well, the Bay Area math is certainly on the forefront of making math visual. I wanted to share a couple of things, speaking of visual things that I created for John. I did a couple book covers. Here's my cover for On Numbers and Games, one of his great classics. And for those of you who are familiar with the mathematics, I used one of his games as the element of the cover. And I'm very fond of doing tributes to people using something of their work. So let's see, here we go. Here's my tribute to John. Everybody see that? The life pattern. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. It's a very nice pattern.
I'll share a link in the chat.
Thank you. Up next is Tom Rokicki. Ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Great.
So my name is Tom Rokicki, and I'm just another hacker. Can everybody see a little light thing on the bottom? I'm going to guess the answer is yes. So John Conway contributed a great deal to mathematics, but he also contributed a great deal to programming and computer science. Maybe a little indirectly, but it can't be understated how impactful his game of life was. I mean, for many people, my generation, it was a gateway drug into computers and programming. About the time I was growing up, microcomputers were just becoming a thing. And when you bought a microcomputer, you got a little box and you got to type in, a little basic program, and that was about all you could do. You could type in little basic programs and run them. And so there were a lot of really stupid games like Hunt the Lumpus or Biorhythms and stuff like that. But there was one game that really stood out, and that was Conway's game of life. you put that 20 lines, 30 lines into your program, and you press start, and all sorts of wonders started happening. And this is Conway's game of life. So there's Gasper's glider gun, and we got a nice restful city over here of blocks. And you know, when I was a boy, I used to sit there and I just used to run this thing and just see what would happen. And it was just so much fun to watch it. And now I'm all discombobulated. Anyway, the city would blow up and you never know what would happen next, right? So would the city come back and blow up the gliders, etc. So anyway, this was fascinating. But on the early microcomputers, it was so slow and painful to run this. So instead of writing it just in BASIC, you'd start to study other things. You'd start to learn new ways to represent the light field, new data structures, segmented bitmaps, linked lists, hash tables. I mean, you really were driven to learn all this stuff just to make this game run faster so you could do neat things with it. And I mean, you start playing around with Boolean algebra as a kid so that you could run life with just and, ors, and nots instead of imperative logic. You learned new technologies like splitters, assembly language, graphics processing units, et cetera, all this driven by this little game. And it was really something you could get passionate about, something that was very inspiring. And it's not just me. I mean, there was a whole generation, all the programmers I know, they really cut their teeth on this game and trying to make unbounded versus finite universes and stuff really drove us to learn so much. And I really have to thank John Conway for that because it was absolutely phenomenal. Andrew Trevorrow and me, we both grew up on this sort of thing. So we started writing this program called Golly, which is what you see on your screen, about 10 years ago or something like that, 20 years ago. And one day, Gosper sent me an email, Bill Gosper sent me an email, and he said that he had shown John Conway this program we had written, and it was the first instantiation of HashLife. So that was a lot of fun because it's much faster. You can do much bigger patterns. And Bill said that he showed this to Conway, and Conway just kept wanting to play with it more and more and more, and almost ruined the conference because they were staying up all night long. And that really was one of the best times of my life when I learned that I gave John Conway just a little bit of pleasure with this program that we had written to, you know, the tiniest, most infinitesimal payback for all the years of joy he had given me in playing with the game of life. So thank you for this time, and Bob for organizing it all and everything like that. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Tom. That is a real incredible contribution you have there. So many of us were inspired by life as children, and our direction of our lives were largely set by that. Speaking of which, someone else who has done quite a lot of cellular automata is up next, Rudy Rucker.
Hi. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. What a stellar lineup we have. Really amazing. To see Penrose here, amazing. And Doris Schatz-Schneider, wow. And Scott Kim. Anyway, like Tom was saying, life for me, that was a big turning point. Martin Cardenas' column on life. And then Gosper's Glider gun. And of course I would do it with pennies and dimes. And I thought, I really wish I had a computer. And I didn't really get my hands on a computer until I got a job teaching at San Jose State when I was about 40 years old. And I got hold of this thing called a CAM6 board, and you could accelerate and run life at these very, very high speeds. And then naturally I moved on to other CAs. There was sort of the idea of life, it kind of died down to just a niche community for a while, but in '85, Wolfram started writing about cellular automata, and there was this big public interest in it. And I put a lot of energy into it. I moved on and got into continuous valued cellular automata instead of just having the 1 and the 0, because you could get kind of nicer patterns. And of course, Turing had worked with some of those. One of his last papers was on morphogenesis, and he did it all by hand. And after like 2 months of these laborious hand calculations. He had a picture of a spot that you might see on the back of a cow, which was sort of funny. But something else I wanted to talk about of Conway's, well, there are two other things. I really got into well, I always just called them the perplexing poultry, the Penrose tiles. And I did a science fiction novel called Freeware, where I wanted people to be having these strange views of the world, and they had this like mental filter they'd wear, sort of a process going in their head, so they could turn whatever they're looking at into a 3D perplexing poultry tessellation, or a quasi-crystal tessellation. And then I wanted to know if there are 4-dimensional quasi-crystals, and so I'd met Bill Gosper when I came out here because of the Game of Life and all that. And Gosper had me on a list called Math Fun, where Conway was often present. And then I asked about that, and then he said, well, yes, there are 4-dimensional quasi-crystals, but they're not very interesting. They look like the factory rooftops. I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but I was just happy that he answered me at all. And another thing about Conway that actually I'm thinking about a lot these days, it goes back to the surreal numbers, which I first heard about them actually reading Knuth's popular book about them. And then later, when I read Shaban Roberts' wonderful biography of Conway, I found out more about his interest in it, and how he had even hoped that they might help find a way to help make a progress on Cantor's continuum problem. And it turned out they didn't really seem to have much leverage on that problem, but Conway had, I think he even talked to Kurt Gödel about it, but he was, it was hard to surprise Kurt Gödel. Whatever you thought of, he'd already thought of. But the book with the wonderful cover by Scott Kim, I went ahead and got that and I studied it. And I wrote a science fiction story called Jack and the Actuals that actually appeared in Wired magazine. And there it was about a sort of science fiction trip into a place that's based on the surreal number line. So the idea being, I'd like it to think that the space that we live in, instead of being the real numbers, it would be the surreal numbers. So space would be transfinitely divisible. You can have these nice things like 1 over Aleph 1, or the square root of that, or raise that to the pi power. You can just endlessly down, endlessly up. And Felix Hausdorff studied these things too. He called them eta onsets. But what I've been doing recently, I've been trying to kick it up a level further and start insisting that the world we live in really is an absolute continuum. And that's, well, in German, you call that ein Philosophie als ob, a philosophy as if. And you don't necessarily believe it because you think it's true, but you believe it because it's fun to believe it. And what I like about the absolute continuum is, you know, usually we're saying, well, there's all the cool stuff is really far away. You know, it takes forever to get to Alpha Centauri, and Aleph 1, we're never going to get there. But what if it's all right here, you know, in the tip of your finger? Basically, you take the inverse of all that stuff, 1 over, and it's all here. Another side benefit of that is then every limited piece of space is an absolute continuum, and it's absolutely infinite. It's as big as the universe, which is a nice way to feel. And there's an argument people sometimes make that if space were infinite, there would be a lot of repetition. You know, they say, well, if we get all quantum and count the number of states on Earth, then that would be bound to repeat somewhere. But if space was absolutely continuous, then within any given region, you couldn't do a counting argument because it would be so large that there'd be no reason that it would have to repeat. So that's something I've been into lately. And I actually wrote about this. I just recently had my book, Infinity in the Mind, reissued by Princeton University Press for the 4th edition. And I put this idea into the preface. That's it. When you're old, you can put crazy ideas into the 4th preface. of a sort of a legitimate book. And so I've been playing around with that idea. And so anyway, I never got to meet Conway. I had a little bit of email with him, but just he's been a wonderful presence. And I'm just really glad that he was here on this planet with us. And that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rudy. Carl Schaefer, are you ready?
Yes. Let me bring up this. So I've always been intrigued and amazed at the many ways that John Conway had fun embodying math and performing math. So over the last few days, Laurel Shastri and I have made a few videos of some of the embodied movement math that I learned from him. So here it goes. And these are the freeze symmetries, the footstep freeze symmetries. And here is step. And sidle, this is a little different version of sidle that you may have seen before, but it has sidle symmetry. And jump. And spinning sidle. Spinning hop. We're not actually hopping, but we didn't want to injure ourselves. So there you go. And finally, spinning jump. And one more, you've seen a little bit of this that Tim did, but there's a variation that I learned from Conway recently. And this is him showing me what I'm about to show you. Most of you have probably seen this method of tying a knot in a piece of rope without letting go of the ends. Conway was very fond of it. I learned it from him at a conference in the 1990s, and you've probably seen it before. There's a little trick, it makes the trefoil knot. But a few years ago at the Moves conference, I sat next to Conway, and he showed me how to start out similarly to that last trick and stop in the middle and ask somebody watching whether they want to see you make either the figure 8 knot or the unknot or the trefoil knot. So if they say, oh, I'd like to see the figure 8 knot, there's the figure 8 knot. And if they say, you know, I think I'd like to see the unknot, well, you stop at the same place, and that's pretty easy to do. But what if the person says, you know what, I'd like to see the trefoil knot. Laurel, would you like to see the trefoil knot?
Of course.
Okay, well, pull those taut. And there's the trefoil knot. And there's, let me get out of this. There's one more, and partly inspired by James Tanton's International Math Salute, but also learned a very slight variation on something I learned from Conway. One of the first body math things I saw John Conway do was at a conference where he said, I'm going to show you how to start with your palm facing up, turn it over without rotating your forearm. And he proceeded to do these 6 right angle turns, and the palm is facing down. In honor of that, in the days in which we now can't shake hands, show you what I call the mathematical hello that I've shown the Bay Area math and art folks. We start with the palm facing us, do the 6 right angle turns, and wave hello. And that's what I've got. Thanks.
Thank you. Chaim, are you ready?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, that was really cool, Carl. I really enjoyed the sidle hop stuff. I just would like to say a little bit about what it was like for me personally. Knowing and working with John was, of course, really amazing and magical, and getting to work with him was truly one of the central wonderful things in my entire life. And hands down, he was the best teacher I ever had And among my friends, well, of course, he wasn't my best friend. That would be a bit, but certainly he was maybe the best of all my friends, with all due respect to everybody else. I'd known of John since I was a kid from Martin Gardner's Colin Books, and of course was fascinated and amazed. And I'd heard John speak when he visited UT where I was a grad student in the late 80s. And on that same trip, he was the life of the party. I got to see the Conway show up close, but of course didn't dare talk to him. But I first really met John in the summer of '93 at a math art meeting in Albany, and then the next month at one of the RGIs that Marjorie was talking about that she had organized. And I met a lot of really wonderful people that summer, many of whom are actually here right now, and some who are already gone. Mark Pelletier, Magnus Weniger, Chip Perry, Donald Coxeter, Charles Peck, Ludwig Donzer, and of course, John. And it was just absolutely amazing to really start to get to know and to speak with Conway. And we hung out quite a bit, actually, talking about a great deal of stuff. And as you know, many of you know, he didn't really always seem to prepare his lectures, but somehow our conversations seemed to be the topic of whatever was the next thing he was going to lecture on. And a year or two ago, I came across a pack of photos, and I don't know who took these. This is from the Albany conference. If anybody knows exactly where these came from, I'd like to hear about it. It has photos of, for example, Mark and Magnus and myself and others. But I think, John was, for me, a teacher and a friend and a collaborator. But I think this photo really sums it up for me. So the little kid in the chair is me, and you all know who the big kid on the floor is. And that's really what it was like for me. The times that we spent together were the best play dates I ever had. And that's all I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Chaim. Colm, are you ready?
Yes. So thank you again, Bob, for putting this together. It's really a wonderful tribute to John. As we all know, he left an indelible mark on numerous and highly varied branches of mathematics, but he did a lot more than that. With his infectious enthusiasm, colorful personality, and disdain for the formal, John became a communicator par excellence, a master of mathematical outreach unparalleled in our lifetimes. He had an unorthodox approach to performance which endeared him to many. Nobody ever forgot meeting John Conway. As book editor Peter Rentz recently observed, anybody who has sat with John has been touched, changed forever. He had a knack for spotting significance where others saw none. Think of his look and see sequence. He had a genius for simplification, an extraordinary ability to see through a complex idea to its very core. Think of his own take on the monster group, Penrose tiles. And he also had a PR man's knack for finding the right words to name things. Why would anybody ever refer to freeze patterns again by any names other than Conway's, the hop, skip, jump, sidle, and so on? I know Carl Schaefer has just demonstrated that to us. Martin Gardner, who was John's senior by 23 years, educated many generations about the joys of mathematical thinking through his highly influential writings, leading to over 40 books on maths and puzzles alone, despite having no university training in the subject himself. John, by contrast, had an abundance of formal education, became a professional, professor. But he also corresponded with Martin for over 50 years, and like Martin, didn't really care what credentials you had, as long as you had something interesting to say. And he provided Martin with some of his most memorable scientific American material, much of it whimsical, yet also connected to deeper and lasting ideas. He attributed part of his own success in so many different arenas to his habit of always working simultaneously on several unrelated problems on and off. He might be stuck on most of them, but suddenly have an idea leading to a breakthrough on another one. So many people, too many, John thought his greatest hit was The Game of Life, which was the basis for Martin Gardner's most read scientific American column back in October 1970. Peter Doyle of Dartmouth College recently remarked that people invariably describe Conway as the inventor of The Game of Life. That's like describing Bob Dylan as the author of Blowin' in the Wind. Well, to that I would add, trying to name Conway's 3 or 4 most important contributions to mathematics is as pointless as trying to identify the 3 or 4 best Beatles songs. There's just too many great ones to pick from. When we invited him to Spelman College here in Atlanta, 25 years ago this very week, he predictably lost his plane ticket the night before and emailed me in a panic. All apologies, but no plane ticket. I had to beg our provost to buy him another one. In those days, you needed a paper ticket. I wasn't tenured, and I began to doubt. I began to doubt if I ever would be. Once we did manage to get him to campus, his visit was a runaway success, which included 3 brilliant lectures and endless tricks and amusements. And yes, he charmed the provost too. His visit was life-changing for me. It gave me permission to have fun in class as a teacher, despite my own very formal education rooted in post-World War II abstraction, an education which included virtually no pictures. John will be remembered largely for the wealth of mathematics he discovered or invented, ranging from recreational to really highbrow. And like Martin Gardner, he not only had the best toys, he shared his toys freely. In about 2013, I was at a dinner with John and Jim Gardner, Mark Mitten, and Vicky Kern after a wonderful MoMath event. A famous problem was discussed briefly, invented by Mike Starbird and his brother Tom. We'd all learned it at a gathering for Gardner back in 2010, in the shortest talk I ever attended, when Gary Fauché said the following 20 words, then sat down. I have 2 children. One is a boy born on a Tuesday. What is the probability I have 2 boys? I looked across the table and saw Jim Gardner and realized that he had exactly 1 brother. So I discreetly asked him what his birthday was. And then I turned to John and said, what day of the week was that date? And without a hesitation, he said, Wednesday. And then caught himself and said, no, damn, Tuesday. He was a little disappointed that he got it off. But at least you now know how Martin Gardner would have answered that question. The probability in his case would be 1. That may have been the last time I had dinner with him. And certainly, I think it's the occasion in which he told me that Fermat would have pronounced the final T in his name, given the era and part of France he grew up in. At the 150th anniversary AAAS meeting in Philly, on the 13th of February, 1998, what day of the week was that? 13th of February, 1998. John spoke passionately about the importance of triangle geometry, reminding us of Preston's edict, geometry is the human interface of mathematics. He worked for years on a book all about triangles, first with Atlanta high school teacher Steve Segura, and more recently with Alex Reba. Alas, that project is currently on pause. John Conway, like Richard Guy, who predeceased him by a month, saw the humble triangle with fresh eyes. A decade ago, he contributed a new proof of Morley's theorem to a reissue of a Martin Gardner book. He once asked, can the ratios of any 2 sides and angles of a triangle be rational? Conway's little theorem says yes, but only in the obvious case of an equilateral. He also discovered a beautiful theorem about triangles known as Conway's circle. I'm going to leave you with that. It's a theorem you'll never forget once you hear it, and you need to tell everybody about it, as long as you live, young and old. Actually, the next speaker, Matt Baker, is going to tell us about that theorem. He's down the road from me here in Atlanta. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Matt, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Baker. I'm a professor of mathematics at Georgia Tech, down the road from Colum, who's at Spelman. And so I've gotten to know John Conway over the years through the gathering for Gardner. But I also had an interesting chat with him when I visited Princeton once to give a colloquium talk there. I'd been invited by Manjul Bhargava, who was a close collaborator of Conway's. And the thing I was speaking about then was something I had come up with called the Riemann-Roch theorem for graphs, which is a sort of game, solitaire game played on a finite graph whose rules imitate a famous theorem in algebraic geometry. And it was something, first of all, that I was proud of and that probably impacted my own math career more than anything else. But also it was maybe indirectly really inspired by the kind of mathematics John Conway did, because Conway had something he called the vowel. I have his biography in front of me here on my Kindle. I just finished reading it actually, so thanks Shaban for writing that. But Conway in there talks about the vow that he took early in his career after some stumbles where he said, "Thou shalt stop worrying and feeling guilty. Thou shalt do whatever thou pleasest." I think he's talking about mathematics there. But that was really the thing that got my career going as well, was coming to that realization for myself. I had some struggles in, I mean, I got a good job after grad school, but I didn't know who I was as a mathematician. And it was giving myself permission to play around, experiment, and view puzzles and games as serious mathematics that actually led to one of the breakthroughs that changed my career around. So I want to thank John for that. But I was very eager to explain this result to him at Princeton, and right before my talk, I found him sitting in the lounge, of course, at Princeton. And we started to talk about that, but somehow the topic changed to calendar calculations, which I also have loved doing, but I use a different method from the Doomsday method. And we ended up talking for 2 hours about the comparative advantages of different methods for calendar calculations. And it was so much fun that I forgave him for not wanting to hear about my theorem about graphs and games. Anyway, I wanted to share my screen for a minute. Is this working? Hold on. If not, I have another way to do this. Is the screen sharing or no?
It's not sharing yet, no.
It's not. Okay, well, I'll do this a different way. So I was just going to talk about, very briefly, about a blog post I wrote. So if you want more details, you can go to my blog. It's mattbakerblog.com. And I talked about several of Conway's mathematical gems, which are not as well known as the Game of Life, the surreal numbers, the Doomsday algorithm, moonshine, and things like that. And I wanted to tell you quickly about the one that Colm Mulcahy just talked about, which is a theorem about the Conway circle that John Conway discovered. And what's amazing to me is that it's very rare that someone discovers a new theorem in Euclidean geometry that's very basic, very fundamental, could have been discovered by Euclid himself or Pythagoras or someone like that. But this one, I believe, was discovered by John Conway. And here's a picture of it because I can't get my screen share to work. So if you can see that, this is actually taken from a Math Camp t-shirt. As many of you know, John spent a couple of weeks out of every summer teaching kids mathematics at a summer camp. And this was one of their t-shirts. And so if you can see this, there's a blue triangle. You start with any triangle. You extend the sides in 6 different directions, right? So at each vertex, you take the 2 natural extensions of the sides. And how far do you go? You go as far as the opposite side from that vertex. So from here, you travel at a distance. This distance is equal to the length of that side there, right? So you do that for all 6 rays coming out of the 3 vertices, and you get 6 new points where those rays stop. And John Conway proved that those 6 points lie on a common circle, which is now known as the Conway circle. And there are many interesting properties, as you might guess. For example, the center of that circle is the in-center of the triangle, the intersection of the 3 angle bisectors of the 3 angles. So you can read about that and many other amazing things that Conway discovered, but isn't as famous for as the Game of Life on my blog. And thanks, John Conway. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together. And thanks to everyone for being here.
Thank you, Matt. That was a great blog post. And while I'm at it, Colm, that was a wonderful obituary in The Guardian. Next up is Chris Palmer. Are you ready?
Yes, hello. Hi. I would like to talk about John as my mentor. And I think the best way to do that would be to talk a little bit about first meeting him and being invited to visit him after an art and math conference in, I think, 97. And he said, come on down and visit me. And as a young artist with no job and complete freedom, I went down to visit him and landed at his, in the summer when it was uncrowded, and spend about a week or so with him studying polyhedra and being getting an amazing privilege to kind of take notes while because when you visited him, he was just working on something and you would get swept into it, as many, many people I'm sure know. The background here is a little diagram that I would draw every day. We would wake up and he would rearrange it and I would draw a new one. And then it had, he was working on a notation for the polyhedra, and it became a chapter in the book that he wrote with Haim. And so it's fun for me to look at that now many years later. And I think the thing that I'd like to hopefully express is how he, just sitting alongside him as he worked on this, gave a sense of a love of tradition. And he taught me about Kepler, kind of a mentor of his, and how Kepler named the polyhedra. And then just the art every day, refining how that notation was going to be to name the polyhedra and to use the system that Kepler used, and to use how the crystallographers named polyhedra, and just his love of the history and who had gone before, but also working on it and jumping in himself and seeing it kind of like an eagle from far above, and just the beauty of that and the pursuit of truth and beauty through elegant names of what these objects were. And it was just so special. And it's just, I'm going to miss him. And that was just one of course, a lot of anecdotes that I could tell, and stories and times spent with him on just a few occasions. I'll end with one, a little different picture of something that he helped me write a paper. But the third time that I kind of went and couch surfed in his office, he helped me write a paper. And it was about some folding things that I was doing in a kind of pattern that would let everything spiral in a tiling. And many, many years later, I discovered that it was about how gears work with each other. That was another way to look at it. And there's an image of that. And I think I'll end with that. Thank you for the organizers and giving me a chance to speak. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Chris. Psychoshin, are you ready to go?
Yes. Okay. I want to tell you first about the first time I met John, and also the last time I spoke to him a week before he died. The first time was when he came permanently to Princeton from Cambridge, and he was sitting in the common room, and I had just come in from playing tennis, and I sat down next to him and I said, "I've just seen an amazing thing. I saw a rainbow in the sky, but it wasn't at the usual angle, of whatever that is, 23 degrees or so. It was much higher in the sky." And just off the cuff, he gave me a perfect lecture on what rainbows do at an angle, and also secondary rainbows and even tertiary rainbows, using the idea of reflection inside a raindrop. We became very good friends in the next few years. But it wasn't until a few years after I had met him, and he'd explained many things to me in astronomy, the classification of Lie groups, the etymology of words, very many things, symmetries of bricks, the brickwork. We went around both the town and the university looking at different brickworks, because they, of course, had to do with symmetry groups. And he even gave a talk afterwards to the university on such symmetry groups. And you saw a talk on stepping, the footprints. He tried to induce the president of Princeton at the time, who had introduced him, to take off of his shoes and socks so that he could do some prints on the floor. Unfortunately, the president refused to do that. Anyway, the last time I spoke to him was about a week before he died. And he was in a care center because of the stroke he'd had a couple of years earlier. And he told me he was in very good spirits. The only thing he complained about was that damned virus which stopped people visiting him. And of course, it was that damned virus that took his life. I just want to say a few things about my work with him. At some point, I told him about some work I had done much earlier with the mathematician Ernst Specker, something called the Cauchy-Specker theorem in quantum mechanics. And he told me he doesn't know very much about quantum mechanics. I said, really the basis of this is really about a three-dimensional bit of combinatorics in geometry. And at that, he picked up his ears, and we had gotten a certain 117 directions in which something happens. And John and I worked on it to try and reduce that number. And we finally got it down to 31 directions. And that's where it stands at the moment. That it has never been reduced since then. In fact, it's known that it must be at least 22 directions for this result to happen. In any case, we started working on quantum mechanics. He got interested in the theory, and we ended up with this theorem called the free will theorem. Now, we had a disagreement on it. It had to do with the response of a particle to looking at measurements of the spin in these 31 directions, or originally 117 directions. And actually, the result is that the particle's response is not a function, is not determined, or a single-valued function of the past history of the universe. And I wanted to call that its spontaneous direction. And he said, no. He said, this is the free will of the particle. And I said, well, free will, look. And he said, look, the word he was wonderful when he came to etymology of words. He said the word spontaneous in Latin just means essentially free will anyway. But the clincher that made me give in was he said, listen, if you want to call it the spontaneous theorem, go ahead. You'll get 2 or 3 physics readers. But if you call it the free will theorem, then you'll get a lot of readers from philosophy and physics and so on. And of course, he was quite right. I want to mention one other thing about his naming. He had these wonderful things that he would name. We all know the game of life, the monster group, moonshine, and so on, the 15 theorem, and of course surreal numbers, which were actually named by the next speaker, I believe, Knuth. But he told me he loved that name, surreal numbers. Anyway, at some point, I came to work with him, and he was sitting in his usual enclave, a little enclave in Fine Hall in Princeton, and he was reading about an African country, Burkina Faso, and it had a wonderful capital called Ouagadougou. Anyway, we started talking about that, and we said, where is it? And he said, oh, yes, it's in the bulge of Africa. But I said, where exactly in the bulge? So we looked it up, and we saw there's a long list of African countries in the bulge, and we decided at that point that we're going to remember all the African countries there together with their capitals. And we came up, it was mostly his work, we came up with some sentence, some mnemonic device, which enabled us to remember it very easily. And he said, okay, now we're going to memorize all the world's nations together with their capitals. And we dropped our work for about 3 or 4 days, and we went through all the nations of the world, the old Soviet Union, all the nations there, and the hardest part was the Pacific nations, I remember. And in the end, we remembered everything. I don't remember a single one of these. It was always mnemonic devices which he had come up with. And he was able to do this. I remember he had forgotten he knew pi to 1,000 places for many years, and he memorized them with mnemonic devices. But 3 or 4 years ago, he said, look, I only remember it now up to only about 300 places. And next week, he had come up with a new mnemonic device, which allowed him to look at every 10 digits of pi and relate it to one of the elements in the periodic table. In this way, he remembered both the periodic table and also all the expansion of pi to 1,000 places. Okay, that's all.
Thank you very much. Some wonderful stories there. Next up, I have on the schedule Don Knuth. I'm not sure if he has seen the schedule. Earlier, he told me he wanted to go last, but Don, if you were ready, I've allocated 10 minutes for you.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Well, the reason I wanted to be last was so that I could listen to what everybody else had said, so that I wouldn't duplicate any of it, and I would try to fill in things that I hadn't heard so far. And of course, John covered so many bases that I still have a lot of things that I didn't hear. So I'm going to try to get. I'm going to try to get through. But I guess mainly I got to say, sort of overall, there's this. Well, superlatives fail me. The best way I can describe John's significance to me personally is that, well, let's see. Words are failing me, but when. Oh, okay. He's my second favorite mathematician of all time. So what do I mean by this? You know, when I think of all the mathematics that I've ever heard about, and then I say, which mathematics do I love the most? And then I say, where did that mathematics come from? Okay, the mathematician who did most of the mathematics I love the most was Leonard Euler. But after that, I put John Conway as having contributed so many other kinds of mathematics that I love very deeply. And you know, I have to put him. You know, Gauss was in there somewhere too. But I put John as second only to Euler. Now, and this is with respect to the things that really warm my heart. You know, the parts of mathematics that everybody has their favorite like composer, their favorite poet, their favorite novelist, their favorite puzzle maker. You know, their favorite algorithm, whatever it is, and there are some things that when you see them every time, you think this is really special to me, and John was that way with me for so many things. Now, people said, when did they first meet him? Before that, I have to mention that we're almost exactly the same age. It turns out that he was just 2 weeks and 1 day older than me. So that means tomorrow I'm going to be just as old as he was when he died, and I now know that I was born on a Monday. And we first met in Oxford in 1967, I think it was, at a conference. I've got this book for the I guess it comes up in mirror image. Anyway, there was a conference where he spoke about knot theory, and I remember that he would demonstrate. He had some kind of beads that he could put together or not, and he could make all kinds of different knots, and he put them together in the middle of the lecture hall, and it was a fantastic lecture. It turned out that the stuff he was talking about in knot theory was a revolutionary new notation that he had actually invented as an undergraduate in 1958. Well, I spoke at that time about something that became known as the Knuth-Bendix algorithm, and according to my letter file, I wrote to him about some topics in computer science. In 1970, I was asking him questions about regular expressions. John wrote this incredible book about regular expressions. Hardly anybody remembers it now. I bet you there's lots of material there that people are going to discover 10, 20 years from now, and it was written way before its time. And regular expressions is one of the key things in computer science, but people didn't know that John actually spent a lot of time on it. Very significantly, in 1972, I met John on a trip to Calgary. It was 24th of February, 1972, and we had lunch together. And he had just come up with his amazing theory of numbers and games, and he showed me, and he wrote out the numbers part of it on a napkin. And the napkin was about so big, and he drew all the theorems on there, and then we put a box around them. Then we get to the next step, and so on. And it was the most fascinating thing I ever saw. I kept that napkin with me for a long time, but unfortunately I've lost it. I have no idea what. Maybe it'll turn up someday somewhere. And that was as I say, February of '72. On May '72, he came here to my house. I was having a weekly seminar on combinatorics, and when people would come into the seminar, they all had to sign our guest book. And so here's, I hope you can see it. This is if you turn the speaker view, anyway, this is May 8th, 1972, where John was the speaker, and his topic was puzzles and games. And I looked through the list of all the people who signed in. I went on to the next page, but I don't think any of you were in this list. Not even Scott Kim, but so many interesting names like Richard Stanley and so on. Then December of 1972, I woke up in the morning, or I couldn't sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning. I decided to write this book called Serial Numbers. The whole thing came to me, a creation story, but instead of Yaveb doing the creation, it's H.W.H. Conway doing the creation. Well, okay, I told you I talked too much about this, but after 6 days, I finished it, and on the 7th day I rested. And on the 7th day, I wanted to write a letter to my secretary telling her how to type the book. And I couldn't compose a sentence at all. I would start a sentence, and I was saying, what was I going to say? And so after 6 days of everything flowing, suddenly I can't write a letter to my secretary. Then we sent a copy of the thing to John, and he noticed that I'd gotten the axioms are wrong. I hadn't remembered them correctly. There's a difference between less than or equal and not greater than, and I had chosen the wrong way. So and he showed me. I visited him at Easter time that year, '73, and he showed me the book he was Numbers and Games that he was writing, and he introduced me to Simon Norton, who was doing all kind of amazing things with surreal numbers, and so anyway, I went back in the summer to a little. It's called Sulheim, and this was in the remote valley of Norway where nobody spoke English, and I rewrote the book 6 more days using the correct accents, and it came out better that way. The theorems weren't as difficult to derive as I had before, and so on. But the whole thing mainly it seemed to be one of these once in a lifetime inspirations that was another out of body experience. Well, people have been talking about surreal numbers a lot, though, so I want to talk about other stuff. I remember when John came to my house, he saw the house number. I live on 1063, and I said, well, and so immediately he said, oh, 1063. That's 2 to the 10th plus 2 to the 5th plus 2 squared plus 2 to the 1 plus 2 to the 0. So this is, the exponents are 10, 5, 2, 1, 0. And you know, he came up with this immediately, and then he said something about, oh, and that's the order of the Zulu subgroup of something or other. But then he said, no, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. It's amazing how his mind thought, because in fact there are rather similar formulas for Zulu subgroups, but this wasn't quite right. Okay, now in 1975 I was giving lectures in Montreal, and again I met John. This was kind of a fateful meeting in Canada, and I was giving a series of 7 lectures about the topic of stable matching. This is where you have boys and girls, and the boys, each boy ranks all the girls, each girl ranks all the boys, and then there are ways to pair them up that are called stable. And a beautiful theory associated with that, and that was what I was lecturing about. And I just given my second lecture, and John came, and I worked out something that in my diary says called a cycle theorem that I didn't know about. But anyway, on that night, John and Wendy Mackay had a party, and John Conway was there, and so I told him about my cycle theorem, and he thought about it for a few minutes, and he completely, totally generalized it and came up with a beautiful fundamental theory that goes into the theory of stable matchings. It says something like this: if you take any 2 stable matchings, where we got boys matched to girls, and then if each boy looks at the girls he has in the 2 ones and chooses the better of those 2 independently of each other, then you get another stable matching. And similarly, the girls could do the same thing. And this means that the set of all stable matchings forms a lattice. And distributive lattice, it's an incredibly interesting result. And he came up with this at this party while we were there. So that was November 1975. Well, one of the incredibly wonderful pure mathematical theory. I think he contributed every branch of mathematics, probably except cohomology. But one of the really important ones is his discovery of finite fields I think, anyway, there's an infinite finite field. Excuse me, I've got to tell a little story here. It's kind of a scandal in mathematics that finite fields exist for every power of every prime, but the proof is non-constructive. Nobody knows how to construct a finite field of order 3 to the 20th. It's not hard to find one. You just try a few things, and pretty soon you hit one. You find an irreducible polynomial. But nobody knows a way to construct irreducible polynomials for a prime and a power. It's just something that we can show it does exist. But there's one exception to that now, and that is that John Conway found an explicit construction using the other part of his theory of games, the kind where they don't make numbers, but all the games have value 0, are sort of parallel to each other. This is so he has finite fields of order 2 to the 4th, 2 to the 8th, 2 to the 16th, 2 to the 32, and so on. And all of these finite fields have a particular constructive rule where you can write down exactly what is the rule for multiplication, and they're all embedded in the same superfield of 2 to the infinity, and this is one of the I think incredibly wonderful aspects of mathematics that he came up with. Now, since Peter Winkler spoke, I wanted to mention something out of Peter's book on mathematical puzzles called Conway's napkin problem, and John was at this dinner at Bell Labs, and Peter was there, and there are these people sitting at a circular table, and between every 2 seats is a napkin. You get to the table, and the first person that gets there gets to choose whether he wants the napkin on the left or the napkin on the right. And another person comes in, and so John said, "Oh, here's a great problem. What's the probability that everybody gets a napkin? Because if everybody's left-handed, then they all get a napkin. But if some are left-handed, some are right-handed, there's a kind of a clash." And so it turned out that this is a really interesting problem where you have 2 to the n times n factorial possibilities. You have n factorial orders in which the people could come in, and each one can prefer left or right. And I learned about this through Peter Winkler's problem book, and then I told several mathematicians who wrote this paper about neat ways to generalize it, where you have probability P and of being left-handed and so on. Well, I got to say quickly, in 1990, several dozen of us were at a conference, and we were in Burlington, Vermont, and we went. Our excursion was to take a hike up Mount Mansfield, and so I spent that entire hike talking mathematics to John. But the main thing I want to relate is that he went barefoot, and there was snow on the ground. So that was our hike up Mount Mansfield. When John was an undergraduate already, he got interested in this thing which he called the quintominal dodecahedron. So the idea is if you have a pentagon and you have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are just 12 ways to arrange them up to rotation and reflection. And so he says, well, you've got just 12 ways to put these numbers on. Maybe we can, we can make a dodecahedron so that everything will match up. Actually, this is a puzzle by Knob. It's not John's puzzle. This one has vertex matching, not edge matching. But I want to try to share my screen now and show you. Let's see if this works. I want to share everything. Yeah, I think this does it. What can you see?
Yes.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes, yes.
All right, so here, and anyway, when John was an undergraduate in 1958, he came up with this problem, and let me zoom. Anyway, it turns out it's a wonderful. How do I get this working here? I'm sorry, I'm not able to scroll down just a little bit here. When I put this in my book, it turned out I just spent several days trying to figure out the answer, and it turned out there are just 3 different ways, but there's so many different symmetries of this thing. It's really difficult to figure out when you've got a different solution, because you write a computer program and you get 120 answers. But then a lot of those turn out to be equivalent. Well, John did this all without the help of a computer. Now, that's part of Art of Computer Programming, volume 4, Fascicle 5, and of course in Fascicle 6 we have the Game of Life. And some applications of the Game of Life, and since we have such a distinguished audience here, I can't resist telling you 2 of the problems that are in this book that I dearly like to know the answer to. That definitely stumped me as I was working on it, and so I go to the next page and. Here we go. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit, but I talk of what I call a mobile path, and a mobile path is something that has the property that it never dies out, but nothing stays alive more than 4 times, more than 4 consecutive cycles. It can be alive at times 0, 1, 2, and 3, but then it has to be dead at time 4. But it should keep going. And I studied all the mobile paths that I could find on a chessboard. So I have 8 by 8, and I insist that the total number of live cells be between 6 and 10. And this was quite fascinating to discover all these patterns. Like this one ends up at a still life, so it's not going to be mobile at the next step. So in each case, if you get to R = 9, it's not mobile anymore. Something happened to break the rule. But now the question that I tried very hard, and I had sets I was running on this for months, and finally had to turn the machine off. Is there one of length 12? I was able to get up to length 11, but I couldn't prove that you can't get to length 12. So those of you who are life hackers, please help me with that one. And then I have another most wanted life question on page where is it? Page. Let's try 147. Okay. 7. Okay, so here I have a table of all the, suppose that we have an infinite life board, and I insist that everything in the upper right and upper left and lower right is originally blank, but I'm allowed to put any configuration that I want in the lower left. Now, how long? What's the earliest time that I can get that I can turn on one of the cells up here? So it always takes me 2 steps at least to get to here, but only 1 step, of course, to get here, and it take me 20 steps to get to go from here, depending on what I want. Okay, now I have a formula that is a lower bound, saying that you always need at least that many steps, no matter what you put in the lower left corner. It's, yeah, you can't possibly get there fast. And the conjecture is that lower bound is tight. That it always, there's always a way, some pattern that's always going to get you there in that minimum number of steps. And in exercise 84, I solved infinitely many cases of the conjecture. However, there are still many more cases that are unknown, and including I think Knight's move patterns, where I don't know are the fastest thing. Okay, now I guess you didn't want me to talk so long, so I got to show you. I guess one. Well, okay. I have a list of other things that I learned from him. That I'll just run through it quickly so you get a sampling. John and I talked about the QD algorithm and determinants. He has this wonderful theorem about non-transitive coin tossing that was only published by Martin Gardner, and then it appears in the book Concrete Mathematics. He had people mentioned his sliding block puzzles, his century puzzle. He found a great, he loved this one. It took 100 steps to solve it. He had a 49 steps puzzle. Art of Computer Programming talks about an idea that he had called animating functions. And we also talk about the wonderful ideas he had on freeze patterns with Coxeter. Now, in 1990s, he showed me something else, which he called a trees pattern, T-R-I-E-Z-E, trees patterns. And I wrote him a letter saying, John, this is great. Have you published it anywhere? He never answered that letter. So I don't know so anyway, the trees patterns exist in my file. But to conclude, since I've been taking a lot of time, let me show you something that I put on the web yesterday. Let's see, I'll go to, let me go to my home page. Whoa, how do I, okay. So I wrote a little paper dedicated to John about a problem that I've been working on the last 3 weeks. In fact, it's sort of been consuming me. But if you go to preprints of recent papers and then you go down to the bottom where it says unpublications, so I got these papers that don't ever go to cake. So this was yesterday, and I have this little note about sign skeletons, and has to do with polyhedra that people were mentioning that as being one of his interests, and I think it's a question that would have really fascinated him, and I got partial results, and I was able to and I got 5 open problems at the end, but let me give you the main gist of it. I'm considering special kind of polyhedra where every vertex is surrounded by exactly 3 faces. You're not allowed to have 4 faces come together. But with this restriction, every edge is either convex or concave, and then you get a cube. You get a graph when you take the skeleton. You just look at the vertices and the edges connecting them, and you get a graph in which it's a cubic graph. Every vertex has 3 neighbors. And so we can draw this graph, but now we say, well, this is a mountain fold or this is a valley fold. So when I have a dashed line, it means I want it to be a concave edge like that one. And so the question, so I looked through all of the cubic graphs of small size, and for example, there's this one, and it turned out that John would just have loved this. That I believe that there are only these 13 ways to get the concave convex situation. Now, with Tom Rokiki's help, I put up a website so you can play around with these things, and so let's go to that. Let's go to that now. Let's see if I can get to. See, okay, here we go. So you have this. You can look at the graph realizations, and you can choose a graph, and then you can play around with it and see what they are. So that's the whole thing. And I have some other examples here where you can play around with other examples. Thanks a lot for the time. Excuse me, there was just too much to say about this great guy.
Thank you, Don. There absolutely is way too much to say, and thank you for sharing so much. We all appreciate it and wish that we could just sit here all afternoon and listen to more.
I'm with you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you again, Don.
Yeah.
We're going to go to Dick Esterly now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dick Esterly, and thanks for coming and allowing me to be part of this. I've known John since 1993 as a result of the New York Times article, where there was a picture of him sitting in his office among his models. And it was a very happy picture. And as a result, I needed to talk to him about some models I was working on. And so I called the math department at Princeton. I said, can I talk to John Conway? He said, well, he's not in his office. I said, well, could I leave a message? They go, well, he won't answer it. I said, well, could I write him a letter? He said, well, he won't look at it. And so I was a little stumped. They said, well, do you have email? I said, well, I guess I could get it. So that was the first email I got. And I actually sent John an email and said, can I show you my models? He said, sure, come on down. So that's when I met him, and he became entangled. So in the last 6 years, I've been living in New Jersey, and I've been able to see John fairly regularly as a result. And I last saw him on March 3rd, and we had a great day talking about stuff. And he left me with the word Tamesis. I don't know, how you like to know words. And he brought it up. We've been talking about British and American slang and how to, he loved to interject 4-letter words into sentences and words. And it kind of left me with the idea of just how he thought about numbers and math. And it was a great, great day. So I was going to say, I always felt a little bit sad when I left John, and now he's left us. So what I'm going to do is show a video from April of 2018. I was going down to the Gathering for Gardner in Atlanta. And so I stopped by and I asked, I videoed him. I asked him to remember Martin. And, he loved the Gathering for Gardner, and he also loved Martin. So it's a little bit over 3 minutes. And after that, it'd be about 10 seconds to just kind of think, and then the next speaker can go on. So I'm going to share my screen here, and then I'm going to start this up. Let's see here. Here we go.
Stories numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on that hang from it. We went out to a cheap restaurant in Dobbs Ferry, I think was the name of the place. Martin's address, and therefore also Charlotte's address, was 10 Euclid Avenue, Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. A very nice address for a person interested in geometry and so on. Anyway, we went to this restaurant, and then the waitress came and dealt the plates onto the table. The table was, one of those things that's a rigid board 2 inches thick. And so she dealt the plates onto the table. And then Martin, as if it's a comment on this way of dealing the plates, picked up his plate and dropped his cutlery through it. The girl screamed because it was so surprising and so effective. And Martin looked around. Has anything special happened? So then he picked up more cutlery and dropped it through the plate. And then in the end, he sort of gave a sort of show off by picking up 10 knives, 10 forks, 10 spoons, and so on, and dealing it right through the plate onto the table beneath. As we were going out, I asked him how he did that. Martin had a sort of understanding that, I don't know how I can phrase this, but the normal convention that a magician's tricks are his own or something and are not to be revealed didn't quite apply to me and Martin. So I said, Martin, you must tell me how you did that. This was as we were going from the restaurant. And he said, yes, okay. He said, later. I will tell you that I wouldn't have done that trick if that restaurant had been a bit brighter. Well, he never told me how to do that damn trick. I'm really upset about that. And he's dead now. Martin, why are you dead? There are so many things I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Dick. Appreciate that. We're going to do Cindy Lawrence next, if you're ready, Cindy.
So, like many of you, I'm going to start out by sharing the story of when I first met John. And we decided to have a conference, the MOVES conference in 2015, I think it was, honoring John and Richard and Elwyn. And just before that, I was at the Bridges conference in Baltimore, and I came across John, and I went to say hello. It was literally the Bridges conference was ending one day, and the MOVES conference was ending the next. And he immediately gave me a few riddles designed to let me know how many daughters and sons he had. And they were challenging, and we walked through them, and I see Gareth is there. Nice to see you. And after a while, I solved enough riddles to satisfy him, and I got up to walk away, and I said, I'll see you tomorrow. We were having a dinner for the honorees at the museum. And he said, tomorrow? What's tomorrow? And I said, well, it's the MOVES conference, and we're honoring you and Richard and Elwyn, and we're having dinner together tomorrow. And he said, oh, dear, I forgot that. Sit down. And I sat back down, and he said, now pull your chair closer to me. Come very close to me. So I came very close to him, and he picked up his phone, and he made a phone call. And I'm not sure who was on the other end. It might have been Diana. And he said to whoever he was talking to, this is John Conway, and I know we have plans to have dinner tomorrow night, but I've just met another woman and I'll be having dinner with her tomorrow night. Goodbye. And he hung up the phone. And that was my first meeting with John, which was very amusing. And I will try to share my screen now because he did come to the conference. Let's see if this works. And hopefully you can all see this. So this was at the Moves conference, and we were delighted to have all three of these giants who unfortunately have all left us within the last year. And John's involvement with the museum did not end with the Moves conference. It began there. This is an image from our first gallery show in the Composite Gallery featuring the Oakes brothers. And it turned out that some of their art was related to some of the work that John did. And so you can see John and Chaim and Joe Cohn and Jade Vinson all joined us for a panel discussion about the artwork. And then we had another Moves conference, this time featuring Percy Diakonis and Manjul Bhargava, and that was on the math of magic. And John came to that conference too, and although he wasn't one of the honorees that year, by popular demand, we brought him up to the stage and had a lovely conversation with the three of them. And during that conference, John spent a lot of time talking with everyone, especially with kids. And out of that, Manjul Bhargava had an idea. Wouldn't it be great to bring John to the museum and have him just hold court in the museum and talk to the public and talk to anybody who came? And we thought that was a great idea, and that's what we did. But I want to share with you a really lovely piece of artwork that Brana Butler painted and gave to me based on what she saw at the Moves conference. And you can see the looks on everybody's faces. And we're hearing a lot of people talk about what a wonderful and accomplished mathematician John was. But what I saw in John was somebody who really could speak to the general public and really engage people and engage kids. And that was really special. While he was spending time visiting the museum, this went on for a number of weeks, one fall, my colleague Tim Nissen and I had responsibility to take John over to a nearby hotel at the end of the day and bring him back the next morning. And I'll just share one other story, which is one morning it was my turn to pick John up, and I went to his hotel room and started knocking, and there was no answer, and knocked and knocked and knocked, and started to get a bit worried about what might be wrong, whether he was okay. But eventually I made my way to the little lounge they had in this hotel on the 4th floor. And that's where I found John, surrounded by hotel visitors. And he delightedly told me that he had discovered that this lounge had coffee 24 hours a day. It never closed. And he didn't sleep much. And so he'd been sitting, doing his doomsday exercise and really entertaining the visitors from all over the world in this little hotel with what day of the week they were born on. And my last, and then after that, I should say, we also featured John in a show that we had called What's So Funny About Math, where we featured a lot of cartoons and then had commentary. And many of you know that John really liked triangles. And so we paired a comment with him about triangles with his comic that had to do with triangles. But it was very fun hearing John tell the story about how he stole a library book from his school about triangles, and eventually several years later did give it back. My last visit with John, with Tim Nissen, my colleague, was not long before he passed in December. Tim and I would make it a habit to visit him periodically, not as often as we would have liked, but anytime we had business in New Jersey, we would stop and see John. And this day he was particularly well, and we were sitting in a lovely, bright area in the place where he was living. And he just was sharp and humorful, and just was really a very pleasant visit. And that's always the way I'll remember him. The one last thing that I want to mention is that a number of us who are working on the design of some new exhibits for the museum have already been talking about perhaps an exhibit that could honor John's memory. The only exhibit we have right now, or the only person who's honored by exhibits in the museum right now, is Martin Gardner. And we can't think of a more fitting person to have an exhibit in his honor. So if any of you have ideas, please feel free to share them with us. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to go before my dear friend Mark Minton. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Mark is next. Mark Minton, are you ready to go?
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Bob, and everyone. It's really exciting to remember our amazing friend John. And to everybody at BAM, I've only been to one of your meetings, but it's thanks to Elwin and David Eisenbud and Rick Summer, and thank you for putting this on. I loved all the comments, and I have many ideas, like the story that was just told last January. So I'm going to try to tell many little stories, and I'll start my timer so I don't go too long. But first, in response to that story, that was the story of Martin Gardner passing cutlery through a table, through a dinner plate. And John had told me about that trick over many years. And I should explain, I don't belong here because I'm a magician. And I only met John through the Gathering for Gardner and that whole community. And my whole relationship with John has been magical because he's brought me into this whole other world of meeting all of you. And it's really changed my life. And I'm so grateful. And so actually at our last lunch with Cy Koshin and Joe Cohn and Siobhan Roberts, this was actually last January, and we went to his Tomo Sushi in Princeton, and that story got mentioned. I happened to read a book from 1885 that had a related but different trick in it. And so John told that story of passing the knives through the plates, and I was able to replicate that trick for him. And it was quite exciting to actually show him that stunt. And I still have to confirm with Jim, who's also here, if I want to look up in Martin's library, his card index, to see his notes on this old book from 1885. I met John. Stan Isaacs mentioned a puzzle, I think, called a Conway Cube. I think that's the puzzle that I met John through. I was at a dinner with Mark Sedidicati, who brought me to the Gathering for Gardner, and Tom Rogers and John. And he gave this puzzle. And I looked at him do the puzzle. And being a magician and not a puzzle person, I was watching the way he was moving. And I saw something. And he gave me the puzzle. And I tried it for about a minute and a half. And I solved it. And then I passed it to Mark Sedidicati and Tom Rogers, who are puzzle experts, and they both couldn't get the puzzle. And I'm a magician, so I kept my mouth shut, and I was very secretive. But I waited till after dinner, and I quietly said to John, I cheated. I saw your wrist turn, and I just replicated your action. And he smiled at me, and he said, everything counts. And it was quite wonderful. What Chaim said is so true. Being with John was like a play date. He made you feel like a kid. And at Gathering for Gardner, I got to know his son Gareth, who I'd already met through Diana at dinners in Princeton. And we had great play sessions. In fact, my last time with him at his apartment was a big play date with Gareth and John, and we just played with a bunch of puzzles and tricks. I wanted to add a couple notes to the knots that have been mentioned by Tim Shu and Richard. Okay, so let's see. All right. Oh. I hope you can see this. All right, I'll try to move slowly. Okay, so the first knot that Tim mentioned was this, which was a hunter knot, which is a magician's knot. The second one that Richard mentioned was really cool because that was John's variation, which is the one that makes the figure 8 knot. So, and I'll do that again so it's nice and pretty. Try to go a little slower. There. And you get a nice, pretty figure 8 knot. But also John loved mystery. Martin told a story about another way to hold a rope with hold on to both ends, and then like so. Wait, sorry, I'm actually trying to look at the monitor. All right, like so, and just instantly tie a knot like so. And John never learned that way, but he would always have me do it for him. And that's was amazing thing about John, is that not only he loved knowing things, but he loved mysteries. And it's, as a magician, it's something that we always talked about. And in fact, Cindy mentioned the Oakes twins and a special session. And in that session, Kepler's mistakes came up on the panel after the Oakes twins at the Math Museum. And it was a special panel on the art of the Oakes twins. And John defended Kepler's right to be wrong. He said how important it was to him as a holder of new ideas, how confusing that was, and how exciting it was for him to hold on to new ideas. But with that came this strange feeling, because you weren't ever actually sure whether or not it was right or wrong. Only time could tell. And it was a beautiful defense of the mysterious. So I realize I'm going over, but just one last story, which is on the Game of Life. It took me about a year to learn the Game of Life from him. I wanted to learn how he originally thought of it, which was as a manipulated game at Cambridge, where he played it for 18 months. And I carried a board and black and white tiddlywink pieces and seashells with me, and he wouldn't play. I tried in every situation, and he said that he wanted to play. But it was at that Moves conference in 2015. It was actually at that picture that Cindy Lawrence showed us. I rolled out the game board, and Richard Guy was there. And the beautiful thing was, he didn't feel really comfortable playing Game of Life until he saw Richard, because Richard was the guy that checked every single one of his moves. And every state was so ambiguous, it's actually a kind of a scary thing to play the game in that way. So anyway, it's the love of mystery. And one last open question. And by the way, this is just an exciting format, and maybe we should do it again to talk about open questions. When I talked to him about the surreal numbers, I asked him about what is the other space from 0 to Cantor's infinity to the surreal infinity. There's some other space out there that's beyond that. What do you call that? And he said, that's the infinite game space. And I said, do you mean like combinatorial game theory? And he said, no, that's Elwyn's language. Richard made sure that we use that. So if any of you know anything about the infinite game space and talk to John about that, I'd love to talk to you. But anyway, thank you very much, Bob, and everyone.
Thank you, Mark. That's very fascinating. I've never heard that term, infinite game space, before. Maybe Aaron or someone knows more. So before we move on, I just need to point out that we're now coming up on 3 hours, and which is our expected length, and we're running quite a ways behind. But we're going to keep the session open until everyone has spoken, and then anyone who wants to speak after the scheduled speakers is welcome to say a few words. Next up, we have Francis Fung. Are you ready?
Yes. Hi. Am I on screen now?
You're on.
Great. Okay. Well, so my name's Francis Fung, and John Conway had a truly life-changing impact on my life in several ways. I first saw John in 1988 when I was a high school student. I saw him give this Dressler lecture at Kansas State on audiological decay. And then I saw him again the next few years at the summer MAA Math Fests, where he was, he was a welcome presence. He was always regaling students like me with engaging topics like the penny tricks, the doomsday algorithms, the tangles. He gave lectures on combinatorial games. And I managed to follow him around enough, like at the meetings, that I ended up sitting with him and Richard Guy and Don Albers at one of those MAA dinners in Orono, Maine in 1991. And I chose this shirt, to wear because I'm quite certain I've met John in it at least once wearing this shirt. So I was sitting there at this dinner, and they got to talking about the Earl Raymond Hedrick lectures that John was about to give the next day. And Don Albers, who was in charge of MAA publications, he said he wished they could get a book out of this. And they were like, well, if there were only someone who could be like a scribe or something. And, me here sitting there in my teenage exuberance kind of eavesdropping, I go, I could do it. And if I recall, Don turned to John and was like, do you know this guy? And John kind of sized me up. He's like, you look vaguely familiar. And so he agreed to give it a go. And that's how I became the assistant for writing the Central Quadratic Form, which turned into a Keras mathematical monograph. I ended up as a graduate student at Princeton, and I spent many sessions working on the manuscript with him in his office, which is immortalized in that 1993 New York Times article, typing tech at that Sun workstation, which at the time was rigged up so whenever he tried to log in, he had to first get 10 days of the week correct. And sometimes he'd redo it if he wasn't happy with his time, so it could take a long time for him to log in. And that reminds me, as I'm thinking about that, if I recall correctly, he never learned how to touch type. So, he would sit there writing his emails. He'd be hunting and pecking with like 2 fingers, and he was quite fast at it. Anyway, the book was published in 1997, and that was the year I got my PhD. And then I left academia to become a software engineer. So, I saw John a few more times over the years when he came through nearby, and I got a chance to see a lecture of his. And one nagging question in my mind, since I wasn't publishing math papers anymore, was whether my assisted by credit on the book, since I wasn't really a co-author, I really was more of that scribe, I'm like, does that count as a link in the Erdős number graph? And I asked him one time when I got a chance after one of his talks, and he was very gracious about it, and I was very gratified when he said, yes, you can count that as a link. So I was real happy. I last saw him in Princeton in 2009 with my family, and we went out for a meal and Siobhan was there already working on the book. And I just, I want to reflect that I learned a great deal about John, about all sorts of things. He would often pull me into that room across from his office and give me like an impromptu lecture for like an hour about something that he was on his mind. And one other story about another way in which he touched my life. I went to a math meeting once to get Coxeter's autograph. Okay, so he was quite old by then, quite famous. And I was like, gotta get his autograph. I brought a stack of like 5 of his books. And I said, while I was saying, can I get your autograph? I said, oh, I've been working with John Conway at Princeton on this book. And Coxeter got very excited. He's like, well, I really want to autograph a book for John Conway. And I said, okay. He insisted, and I said I didn't want to disappoint him, so I had to kind of decide on the spot which one of my books to present to Conway later. They were all mine, but I was like, okay, fine, I'll designate one and give it to him. And so by the time I was done getting all these autographed books signed, I started packing them away very elaborately in my backpack. Everyone else went off to dinner, and I was the last person in this room, except for one other student. And she came up and she introduced herself to me. And that's how I met my wife. So, there's one other way in which John touched my life. 2 other very random things that come to mind while I was talking. Somebody talked about acetate sheets. And I just remember one time he was giving a lecture and he needed to erase something. And he had to be real quick about it. And he just took it and he licked it. He licked it off and cleaned it up. And Don Knuth talked about Euler. And I remember him telling me that he was one of the few people who went and read all the old works. He respected the classical works. And he said he cut the pages. He cut the pages of some of those Euler's like published works in Cambridge because, no one had ever looked at them before. So anyway, I'm just so grateful. He taught me so much about how to look for mathematically interesting problems in situations where I didn't realize there might be any. And I'm grateful to have this opportunity to pay tribute to someone who's touched so many lives, including mine. Thank you.
Joseph, can you hear me? Yeah, we've unmuted you. Sorry.
It's me, Joe. Yeah, it's Joe Conway.
Yeah.
You hear them?
You're up.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see you too.
Okay.
You can see me. Okay. So I just want to say a few words here. Of course, John was a great friend of mine, and I could tell many, many anecdotes, but there were so many anecdotes already. So I'll just concentrate on one little topic, and that is the tremendous impact that John had in our department. So he came to, when I was a graduate student in Princeton, the main center of activity was the common room. The graduate students didn't have offices. They were always hanging around the common room. And there was tea in the afternoon, and it was like a bazaar, tremendous excitement. People were playing games. There were professors, stars, like Artin, who would sit there literally surrounded with people sitting at their feet. And there was a kind of an atmosphere. And of course, that was in the 50s. And then as the years went by, things sort of became more professional, more sedate, and more somehow graduate student offices. There wasn't so much time, this, that. All of that changed dramatically when John Conway came. He brought back the old spirit of games and of discussions and so on, and so he made a tremendous difference in the common room. Now, he was also very, he had this, every visitor to Fine Hall would have to be shown Conway's office, because it's a spectacular thing where he had these wonderful objects that he made, and all kinds of polyhedra and various things. And he had a tremendous knowledge about all these things, not only mathematical, but also how they related to crystallography and chemistry and so on. So really got an education when you talk to him. And he had a sort of an audience all day long, where people would come up. He would usually sit in the car, on a chair in a corridor, and people would come up and have little seminars and sessions, and there was always someone. And I was lucky enough, let's see if I can make it show this. I was lucky enough to take a picture of it, and I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, let me hold it up. Dad.
No.
Let me technically give it technical.
Yeah, can you see it? So this is, I think I was lucky to catch him at a typical moment. I think for the sake of the length of the meeting, of course, there are many, many anecdotes and meetings that we had, et cetera, but some of which are written up in Siobhan's wonderful book. But I think I'll quit here and let the next speaker go. It's getting late.
Thank you, Joe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Wei Hua Huang, and a lot of people are sharing personal stories about John, but I've only really interacted with him at the gatherings, where we do spend a lot of time chatting together, because he and I, turns out, have something that we have in common that the other attendees don't have, which is that we get really bored of the presentations and like to go out to the lounge and just wander around and chat. But the story I want to share is this, one of the most valuable presents that John ever gave, which he gave me around the time I was born. And it's also, one of the most valuable presents I've ever received, because I got this about 10 years before I ever met him. And by the way, I don't mean valuable as in something like philosophical or intangible. I just mean money. It was extremely valuable in a monetary sense. And so I'm a high school student, and I'm like one of the top math students according to some math competition. And I'm trying to find a research paper, because apparently all smart kids have to do research papers in high school instead of just doing puzzles and stuff. And I come across the book of Winning Ways. Let me go ahead and find it on the bookshelf here.
Oh. No, he's wandering in the wrong.
Am I still online? Well, so can everyone still hear me? So I've got this copy of Winning Ways. It turns out that, and I'm looking through it, looking for some idea for a presentation to do here. And and I devour this, and it's really fun. There's all these games and stuff, but I really don't know what research to do, because this is all very hard math, and I'm just still sort of a high school student. So over here, if I can flip to the right place here, I come across this little one throwaway line that he's got here on page 729 about the Peg Solitaire Army here. And you can see that it says, the last line says, "The two men with guns can be moved to the shaded places so as to obtain the only other arrangement." The Solitaire Army, turns out that it's this complicated, it's this math problem which has where the more pieces you have, the harder it gets. And it has this really strange sequence that goes 1,
2, 4, 8, 20, then infinity. So in the case of 20, according to Winning Ways, there's only 2 solutions. There's two arrangements. He shows one in figure 23, shows the other one. It's based on some work by John Beasley, who did some stuff in the 60s, who then reprinted the puzzle, reprinted that particular problem that Conway came up with, and in his book, The Ins and Outs of Peg Solitaire. And I noticed when I was looking through this that John's 2 solutions were different than John Beasley's 2 solutions. And they both said that there were 2 solutions, but they weren't the same 2 solutions. So I said, maybe there's something here. So I go and write a paper. This is 1993. So, I'm doing this on WordPerfect. The internet doesn't exist yet. I have to go to actual libraries to do research. And so I write out this paper. I try to come up with some generalizations as to whatever, something that a high school student could do. I looked at my old paper recently, and it's stuff like, I've got this 10, 20-page paper that turns out to be a lot of handwritten analysis of stuff that I could probably program these days and do in 10 minutes. But so I sent it off to the Science Talent Search, which was run by Westinghouse at the time. And I guess maybe they didn't know deep math or something, because they thought this looks kind of impressive. And so they invited me to be one of the 40 finalists in the world to be in this competition. And then at the end of it, I ended up being 6th place in the United States, winning a scholarship of $60,000. So I won. So I picked up basically a third of my college tuition, mostly because of that one little throwaway line that John wrote in Winning Ways. So if any of you are ever mathematicians working on your magnum opus, one piece of advice: if you really want to inspire some smart kids out there, don't double check your work. All right, that's the story I have to share. Thank you all very much for letting me tell it.
Thank you, Wei-Hua. Up next, Barry.
Hi, yeah. Am I on?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Well, I first got to know John at a conference we were both at in December 1993. I'd known of him and had met him a couple times before that. But as it happened, a couple of weeks before the meeting, I was looking at Martin Gardner's book and looking at some Penrose tiles in this book. And it suddenly jumped out at me that the Kites and Darts tiles could be nicely thought of as shadows of, if you take a rhombus with a 72-degree angle and bend half of it out of the plane, then the shadow of the perimeter, if you bend it to the right amount, becomes the kite. And if you bend it by the same amount past the vertical, the shadow becomes the dart. And the key thing here is that it took me a while to convince myself that the rules for putting Penrose tiles together was consistent with gluing these bent rhombi in space, so that you wound up with sort of a 3-dimensional chicken wire mesh whose shadow is the original Penrose tiling. And knowing that Conway would be at this meeting I was going to go at, I thought I would tell him about it. And so I made up a little paper model of a Penrose tile with bent rhombi, and took it to the conference at the opening cocktail party the night we all arrived. I took my model up and introduced myself and showed it to him and explained the idea. I kind of expected him to say that's nice, but of course you can do this. This is, I sort of figured it was probably well known, but instead he took my model and looked at it, and he said 2 things. He first said, "Well, that's quite lovely." And then he looked at it, and then it looked at me and said, "But of course you did it wrong." And he proceeded to explain, just off the top of his head, that instead of taking the rhombus with the 72-degree angle and leaving half of it flat and bending half of it, it would be actually nicer to take rhombi with a 60-degree angle, in other words, two equilateral triangles, and bend both halves out of the plane to appropriate amounts. And again, the shadow would become the appropriate kite or dart. And in particular, where you have on a Penrose tiling, 5 kites that come together at a point, if you just draw the diameters, I'll show you a little thing, you're actually looking straight down at the top half of an icosahedron. And this is kind of obvious when you know to look for it, but apparently it hadn't really ever been noticed before. So at the next morning, he came up to me and growled at me, and he said, "You owe me 2 hours sleep. I was up half the night thinking about your tilings," and he had worked out his own proof that the rules for fitting Penrose tiles together was consistent with this mesh being a nice continuous type of surface. So it was sort of a nice thing to hear. It told me that this observation I made was actually in some way new, at least to John. It also told me that 2 hours is half a night's sleep. So it sort of said about how much he slept per night. So I think I'll stop with that and pass it along to the next person.
Thank you, Barry. Just to explain, Bob has had a little issue with his earbuds, I think. So I'm going to step in a little bit here. George Hart. George.
I'm here. Do you hear me? Do you see me?
I can hear you and see.
Okay. And you see me. I'm going to try and share my screen. Is this coming through? Do you see a little PowerPoint presentation?
It's coming, yes.
Okay. So I want to just briefly give a concept for what I think of as something that would be a wonderful memorial for John Conway. There's a lot of things I could say, but basically I met John in the 1990s, first at some art and math conferences in Albany that Friedman had organized. There's a picture of him wearing a musical instrument sculpture that I had made, I had brought there. It's something that you kind of bang on. It has an icosahedral symmetry, and it's hard to see, but there's 2 wires that go up to a little headpiece, and the sound just kind of conducts directly into your head, and it's just kind of a fun experience. But this sort of just shows the playfulness that John was like immediately jumping into this and enjoying it and trying it out, and always just sort of willing to share himself and try new things. At one of those conferences, he talked about a notation for thinking about polyhedra in terms of transformations. He had described a kind of notation where capital letters were polyhedra, like an I for an icosahedron, and little letters were transformations. And he sort of started with Kepler's understanding of the Archimedean solids and went from there. And I was kind of impressed by that sort of picture. It suggested that you can generate an infinite number of things. I went home and I wrote a little computer program, or a big computer program, that you could simply type in his notation, like STI, and out would show up on your screen. They're the stub truncated icosahedron, and then you can generate 3D printed models, etc. And used it to generate a bunch of sculptures, sort of based on the whole family of transformations that he had described. And did a number of trips to Princeton, brought him things, showed him things. Here's a picture of a CD sculpture I had made. He saw this in the back of my car and he said, "Oh, can I have that?" And in just a nice British kind of way. And I said, "Well, of course, if you want it, it's yours." And we hung it up, and it was in the lounge, the math lounge at Fine Hall for roughly 10 years. I don't know exactly. I have a new sculpture there now. And there's a typical sort of way I would load up my car before driving down to Princeton. So what happened that was, I'm going to show you here, I don't know if this is large enough to read, but this was probably the most exciting email I've ever received in my life. he sent me a note and said, why don't we write a book together? Just because he was such a genius and we had had so much fun together just talking about everything. This was just a wonderful project. So we spent about a year. I would go down to Princeton about one day a week. Now, most of the time we would just sort of, have Chinese food or drink tea. We'd play with lots of models and puzzles and things that I would bring. We did some actual math. Didn't go very far. Mostly I just remember this as really one of the greatest intellectual periods in my life, just spending a lot of time with them, talking about everything, having lots of fun. The book never really got very far. We just wrote longer and longer versions of the table of contents. But one thing I want to say that really excited him was this idea of a polyhedral park. So this is something Chris Palmer kind of alluded to, he had in the background behind him. But John really wanted to create an outdoor sculpture park where polyhedra would be the shape of lampposts, and you could walk around, and various paths with transformation. So this is a kind of a typed map that he had made and sent me. And he had even found a possible sponsor. So he had asked me, the two of us, we went and visited a millionaire who had a Fifth Avenue apartment overlooking Central Park and tried to pitch the idea. It didn't go very far. He revived it for a while. Around 2012 or so, we discussed making some 3D printed models. I'll show you the basic idea that here's a cube. This would be one lamppost. As you'd walk along a path of truncation, the paths would get, the lamppost would show various stages on the way to an octahedron, and then pyramids would pop up as you continue along a different path of elevating, and you come back to the cube. And this idea was to make an actual physical park that would show people some of the beauty of polyhedra and some of the mathematical ideas of transformation. And so those pictures I showed you I had actually made into a flip book, and we showed them to the potential sponsor, but it didn't go anywhere. Anyway, just the idea I'd like to plant a kind of a seed in people's minds that if there was a way to sort of make a memorial John that would be kind of accessible to the public and show something that he really found beautiful and playful. Here you can see a drawing he had made of some of the paths in this polyhedral park at a talk he had given. This picture sort of shows my favorite way to think of John, just sort of very physical, having fun. He brought these models from his office and taped them on the blackboard as he was giving the talk. It's just sort of an idea I'd like to give people to think about. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a polyhedral park to memorialize John? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And Jane Gilman, you are up. Let me see if I can find you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Bob for adding me at the last minute. I work in a different field than John in Teichmüller theory. But I team taught an experimental math course with him, along with Bill Thurston and Peter Doyle in 1991. And we taught it once in Princeton and once at the Geometry Center in Minnesota. And many of the things I have to say have already been said, but I want to say something about the Minnesota course. There was a mixture of graduate students, undergrads, postdocs, and high school students. And the four of us who were teaching it thought it was a wonderful thing that we were doing. I don't know what the students actually thought, but when we were planning the course, we would talk far into the night about the next day's class and about mathematics. And at some point, John talked about his early years, which I don't think anyone here has talked about much, but he described his early life in a small town, which now I've come to see was Liverpool, not so small. But he described himself as being pegged as an introverted math nerd. And he explained that when he left this small town for Cambridge University, he decided that he could assume any persona he chose, as nobody already knew him at Cambridge, and he chose to be outgoing, even flamboyant, and the center of attention from an admiring crowd that often surrounded him. That is, he became the charismatic center of things. And I once saw him actually from a distance in 1969 being the center of a big group of mathematicians. So those who met him later would think of him as self-confident and assured. But I remember once in 1991, after one team taught class, I criticized his concern for students and he cried. And I regret that I did that. I hardly knew him at that time. When I was preparing in 1994 to teach this geometry and imagination course at Rutgers, John made me a set of the cardboard 5 Platonic solids. And ever since, they've hung on the walls of my office, except when I was using them in the classroom. But last spring, they began to crumble and fall apart. And I think now that was perhaps an omen of the end of an era. So thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Jane. So, Bob, I think you're back on audio, correct?
Okay. We have reached the end of our speaker list, and thank you all very much for coming. This has been an amazing event. But we're not done. We want to open it up to anyone who wants to say anything who wasn't on the speaker list. I think probably Glenn Whitney has said he has something to share if he's ready. And anyone who wants to say something, send me a message or just send a message to everyone, and we'll sort of queue you up. But let's move now to Glenn if he's ready. Yep.
Hi, yeah. So I didn't. Well, I think like most of us, I had many fewer personal interactions with John Conway than I would have loved to have had. But one was that it fell to me several times to have the privilege of being his driver for a couple of trips back and forth to Manhattan. And I can tell you, I think those are the least dull drives of my entire life. So, you know, we would talk about this and that. And at one point he just said, I started talking about how, you know, it wasn't too long into my career that I started to develop a sort of reputation. And he didn't elaborate, but I think I kind of knew what he meant. And he said, it wasn't so much longer after that that I began to realize that I had this reputation. Okay. And then he said, and it wasn't so much longer after that that when I would be in a situation where I felt like I should do something, but I wasn't quite sure what to do, I would just ask myself, what would John Conway do? And that's how I would decide what to do. And, you know, I think if it was good enough for John, it could be good enough for the rest of us. So next time you're not quite sure how to proceed, just ask yourself, what would John Conway do? And give that a shot. That's all.
Thank you, Glenn. I see that Mike Stranahan has managed to log in. So Mike, if you are ready, we will go to you now.
Okay, thank you so much. And my story is briefly told. We have to go back to 2002. We have to go to Toronto, Canada. We have to go to the Fields Institute of Mathematics. And I'm going to start my video so you can see me. God, is that worth it? The purpose, there was an event at the Field Institute, and I was there. And the event was the installation of a hyperdodecahedron, which is a 4-dimensional dodecahedron, simple, 6 feet in diameter, at the Fields Institute, hanging in the main hall and lit by lights and spinning slowly. It really was very beautiful. And the designer was there at the Fields Institute, Mark Pelletier, and his wife, Amina Allen. And I was just come along. So we're getting to the point where everybody is in a lecture hall at the Fields Institute, and the whole purpose is to pay tribute to Donald Coxeter, the father of modern geometry. And so people are getting up and speaking. And then finally, John Conway got up and spoke. And he said, he began his remarks by saying, you know, I think the first thing I want to say is that Donald Coxeter, sitting right here to my left, whom we are here to honor, once tried to kill me. Audible gasp from the audience, stunned silence. What was this man meaning? So John waited kind of a pregnant pause, and then he said, well, of course, he didn't quite succeed. It happened when I was attending a lecture, and at the lecture, Coxeter was speaking, and Coxeter posed a mathematical problem that was so interesting that it absolutely took over my mind. And instead of listening to the lecture, I just thought about the problem. And then when the lecture was over, I got up out of my chair and I was thinking out about the problem. I walked out of the lecture hall and I was thinking about the problem. I started to walk across the street and I was thinking about the problem. And of course, I didn't see that truck coming towards me. And the truck hit me, didn't kill me, but I've always been able to say that Donald Coxeter tried to kill me. Hilarious and delighted applause from the audience. And a wonderful moment. And thank you, John Conway. And thank you all. And thanks for letting me in. And thank you, higher power. We were privileged to have known him.
Thank you, Mike. That's a great story. Up next, Tanya, I believe, Tanya Kavanova, I assume, would like to speak if you're ready.
Hello, do you see me?
Yep.
I don't see
Yep.
myself.
You're on. Yep.
Once I visited John at Princeton, and he was dismantling his office. He was told that his office was a fire hazard, and he has to remove all this polyhedra that was around his office, putting them in the garbage bags. So ask him to give me his favorite toy. So I want to show you. He gave me this. Do you see it?
Yes.
Well, he made it himself. So this is it.
Thank you. I don't see any more messages for anyone else who wants to speak. If anyone has anything more to say, please send a message either to me or to everyone. Sorry, I wasn't looking for raised hands. Okay, Colin, you're unmuted.
Okay, a very brief recollection. I sent Conway my undergraduate thesis when I was thinking of applying to Cambridge, and it was only when I arrived at Cambridge much later that I discovered that, in fact, he never opened his post. So he never got my thesis. But when I arrived at Cambridge, I did ask, where's Conway? And somebody pointed at the other end of the room saying he's down there with the beard, the sandals, and the acolytes. So I decided I wouldn't become one of the acolytes in that sort of way. But I did end up meeting Conway when I was wheeling my unicycle down the street, and he came running after me. Quite a few people ended up being quite envious of this idea that Conway would actually run after me. And I don't remember what it was that he asked me. I was so shocked. But that was my first meeting with Conway, and we ended up playing backgammon a lot in the department. He didn't play backgammon much with other people, but I played a very weird style. I would play an extreme back game, an extreme front game, an extreme running game, constantly switching between. And he found that intriguing to try and find a way of countering the extreme forms that I'd flail between, because he wasn't so much interested in winning, He was interested in a game that was fun. And that was, of course, the main thing about John, was that he was always interested in something that was fun and finding what went on inside that. So that was my experience of John. I met him many times afterwards and ended up in many conversations, which enriched my life enormously. And I'm just so sad that it's not going to happen again. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Colin. Glenn Smith has a quick memory to share, he says.
All right. I had a chance, thanks to Siobhan, to spend some time with Conway in several different locations. The first time I was at Coxeter's house, and I understood how much Coxeter appreciated Conway and vice versa. Then later at the Coxeter Legacy in Princeton, I had a chance to spend some time with John at his house, and he was so very gracious. I shared an idea that I had on a how you move a cube octahedron into a rhombic triconahedron. And so we went through the model, and out of that came this octa bug, as we called it, with the coordinates of the various structures one could make. And at the end of this meeting, he said the nicest thing to me, because he had been quite excited about the movements that we were doing with the flexible cube octahedron. And I don't have the model here with me because we were just talking through it. But he said, I consider a good day when I learn something new. And when he shook my hand and he said, I want to thank you for a good day. So I'll always remember that I got a chance to get some one-on-one time with him, and he was very, very gracious. Of course, his ability to think through problems was second to none. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. I have a message that David has a few anecdotes to share. I'm not sure, David, who, but I will unmute you and we will find out. Are you ready, David?
I am unmuted, it says. Can you hear me?
Oh, David Singmaster, welcome.
Right. As most of you know, I'm settled in England since 1970. And at that time, I met Conway. And I used to go up to Cambridge to the common room and be amazed by the junk that had piled up in his office. But I got involved with the London Mathematical Society, and at dinner after one of the meetings, Conway had been the speaker. And he held forth about the calendar, which was really quite fascinating because we think of calendars as a mathematical problem, but he had studied the problem of the change from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. And he had actually gone and looked up the Act of Parliament, which in 1752. And it turned out to be immensely complicated. It didn't just involve skipping 11 days, but the problem is all the saints whose holidays fell during the period involved had to be reallocated. Some of them were omitted, some of them were moved ahead 11 days, some were completely moved. So I spent a long evening listening to John's exposition of all the problems. But in the middle 70s, I was at the British Combinatorial Conference in Cambridge, and I got assigned to chair a session which Conway was in. And he arrived a little bit late, and he said, I think I've got an hour. And I didn't have the nerve to say he only had half an hour. And at the end of half an hour, he was in full flow. And I don't know if any of you have ever had the well, the duty to try to cut off John Conway in the middle of a lecture. And nobody else in the room wanted to stop either, so we let it go on for an hour. And another incident, he was giving a talk to the Royal Institution, and I was asked to do a display of puzzles for the talk. And I came in with a couple of boxes of puzzles and put them out on display and so on. And John came over to me and said, David, would you mind taking my girlfriend out to dinner? I thought this was a bit strange, but it turned out he hadn't checked. And the dinner that he was being given in the Royal Institution was around Michael Faraday's table. And this had a fixed number of seats. And he hadn't bothered to ask if he could bring his girlfriend along. So I had to take his girlfriend out to dinner, which was a rather pleasant, unexpected pleasure. Anyway, that's just some of my personal contacts with John.
Thank you, David. Let's go now to Rosie. I believe this is Rosie Conway, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's right. I'd just like to thank you all for this wonderful, wonderful tribute. I've been glued to it for the last, well, I guess 3.5 hours, but I'm going to have to go now because it's getting on for 3 a.m. here in England. And real life's going to hit me, I guess, in the morning, though it's a rather unreal life now. For coronavirus and for losing my wonderful father. And it's so gratifying to know and to have seen and heard from a few of the people who hold him in such high esteem. Thank you very much for this. And I'd like to look at it again at leisure. So I hope I'll be able to do that. Thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And yes, we are recording it, and we plan to share the recording. It will take some processing time, but we'll make it available. And thank you so much for joining. Good night. And I'm told that Diana wants to speak. I had not seen that, so Diana, I'll put you on right now.
Hi, everyone. I was afraid this was going to be too sad, but I've really, really enjoyed it. And I've listened to everything everyone said, and it hasn't made me sad. It's made me really, really happy. And just like Rosie said, it's really, really gratifying to see how much John touched so many people. And I'm sorry our son's gone to bed, but he was on for a little while too. John's in the room, by the way, just so you know. He's on the shelf. So thank you, everyone, so very much.
Thank you so much, Diana. We really appreciate you joining us all, and we're touched. Paul, are you ready to say a few more words?
Yeah, although I don't know what to say after what Diana said.
Yeah.
I think what John Conway taught me personally was that everybody gets to have their own math. You can go as far out as you want, and it's just fun, That's all the mathematicians that are speaking tonight, and the artists, and I hate to differentiate, but they're all talking about having fun, and that was certainly my experience with Conway. And I think, I hate to paraphrase Max Planck, but I would say this about mathematics: it advances funeral by funeral. But I'd say it in the best light with John, because when he died, he sort of opened up math to everybody. I mean, the 21st century math is math anybody can play with and have fun in. And I think that's a wonderful thing. It's a great legacy. So I guess that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Paul. Rebecca Mercuri, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Yes, hi, thanks for recognizing me. This has been an amazing evening. We're coming up on, this is our 40th year of the Princeton Association of Computing Machinery, IEEE Computer Society, and I've been on the board for most of that time. So we, at some point, came across the, John Conway, who gave a keynote address for one of the IEEE banquets, and that's where I first met him. It has to have been in the 90s. And then we just, all of us, those of us who knew him, Roger Toby, who I know is on watching tonight too, we got to know him. He was just so generous with his time, and that's what the thread I'm hearing from all of this. Roger and I, much more than me, but I would occasionally go also with Roger to that hallway, this famous hallway in Fine Hall, and if he was there, you could talk to him and, engage in conversation. And we would also many times ply him with food. I heard Toma Sushi mentioned many times, this was one of, his favorite places. And if you bought him a meal, he'd be very happy to give a talk for our organization. And so we had the Gardner Celebration of Mind, which was an outgrowth of the G4G events. And we were holding those annually, and Conway would come and, give like a 15 or 20-minute talk, just a pre-talk to our computer graphics show, and, bring members of the family and that sort of thing. And it was just a really wonderful opportunity for him to be there. He shared with us so much. So many hundreds and hundreds of people got to hear him just in these short lectures and occasionally longer ones at the banquets and things. But there was one memory in particular that I wanted to mention, and this is sort of fitting for the end of all of these great, wonderful recollections. There was one of these times where, we were eating together outside. It was a very hot day. I remember it was, we were outdoors near one of the ice cream parlors. He loved the ice cream parlors as well. And just sitting there, and he was musing about all of the many things he had worked on. By then he had won so many awards and all of his great publications. And he started saying to me that he came to the realization that everything he had worked on was really just a variation of the same thing. And he seemed very distressed by this. And I said, do you really believe that? They're just so diverse in all of these ideas. And he was very despondent, actually, and really felt that it was all the same thing. It was all working out the same problem. And he felt that he was, I mean, how he could say this, but he felt that he was not tremendously creative because he was always working on the same problem. But, of course, what all of this discussion attests is, the amazing insights that he had. And I guess I'm leaving this as an open question. Did he ever write down the connectivity? At first I thought he was just pulling my leg, but he really insisted that he really believed this. And maybe someone will find this in his papers, or maybe someone will be able to demonstrate the connectivity of all the things that he worked on. But I do wonder about that. And I also do understand why it might have made him sad, but he shouldn't be. So thank you very much, John. And thank you very much, all of you, for having this great evening and remembering him.
Thank you, Rebecca. Lucas Garone, are you ready?
Yeah, so I had the privilege to meet Conway a few times because he still traveled lots of places. And one of those was Canada USA Math Camp, where he would still go every year to just talk with students. And he was always generous with his time. And I knew this was the math camp to go to because, of course, Conway went there. And I learned a few things I would never be able to hear anywhere else. And many people know me for Rubik's Cube stuff. And he told me about a bit of the very early history. And he told me, when I lost interest in those kinds of puzzles was when the 4x4x4 came out. Because there would be variation after variation after variation, and there would never be any end of it. So he stopped doing that, and he left all that big area of math open for us. And there's still a bunch of nice, low-hanging, unanswered fruit. So I guess I'm thankful that he He did enough to get that started and stepped out of the way for us to still do some of it.
Thank you, Lucas. Danny Slater wanted to speak next, I believe. Are you ready?
Yeah. Hi. So, I mean, I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon. I spent a semester at Princeton in the early 90s, I think maybe 1991, when they were doing the Geometry and the Imagination course with Bill Thurston and Conway, and they were doing, and Peter Doyle, they were doing this amazing course. And I got to know all of them, and I ended up writing a paper with Bill Thurston. But I was, I spent some time with Conway as well. And one time my dad was visiting, and I introduced him to John Conway. Went to his lab in Fine Hall, which was all the models and all that stuff, and all the students were hanging out in there. And he made this thing for my dad, and unfortunately I lost it. I don't have it anymore. But during this meeting, I decided to make it myself, and I made one. I have it right here. I'll show you in a second. It's an optical illusion that Conway made, and he gave it to my dad. So here it is. I don't know if it's going to work for you guys. So here we have just a cube, right? But when I twist it, it's going all the wrong way. I don't know if it's how you're perceiving it, but it looks like the front corner is sticking out toward you, but actually that's not what it is. It's the other way. So anyway, this is something that John Conway showed me and my dad. It was really, really cool, and he gave the model to my dad. So that's my story about John Conway.
Thank you, Danny. Very fun. Neil Calkin, are you ready?
I am. I just wanted to say that John was the most amazing speaker that I have ever seen. He could take any concept and explain it to any audience, be it a PhD mathematician or a 5-year-old child. And I would come out of listening to him speak with an almost visceral understanding of whatever topic he had been speaking about. And it was fantastic. And it would last for about 30 minutes. It was like Chinese food. I would be hungry again 30 minutes later, and I could not reconstruct my understanding that he had left me with. And that is the thing I miss most about John. Thank you for running this, Bob, and everybody.
Thank you, Neil. Well, this has been incredible. I think we've been blessed to have an amazing set of speakers and this amazing opportunity. It's been we're 4 hours in now to sharing our memories, and I think John alone could still be talking if I hadn't stopped him. We could go on forever.
If I could interrupt.
Yes.
I'm going to stop the recording, but I think that I'll change the rules so that it will allow people to unmute themselves. So that would allow people to just speak up if they have more to say. But we're going to leave that part out of the recording. So thanks everybody for coming. It's been, an amazing 4 hours.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you to Frank Ferris, who is actually hosting this Zoom session, and to Scott Gortman for co-moderating, and to Stacy with the BAM organization.